Well, hello there, my friend. I'm glad you found your way here tonight wherever you happen to be watching from. Maybe you already have a blanket pulled up around you, or a cup of tea going cold beside you because you got a little distracted scrolling. Either way, I am glad you stopped scrolling long enough to land on this one. Tonight is not a small story. It is one of the heaviest, strangest, and in its own quiet way, most human stories the last century ever produced. So take a breath, get comfortable, let's start slow. On a warm morning in the summer of 1942, a 13-year-old girl in a Russian city on the Volga River poured tea for her mother and thought absolutely nothing of the sky above her. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, more than 400 German bombers would turn that same sky black, and by nightfall the river beside her home would actually be on fire. She had no idea. Nobody in her city did. And what happened to her over the next few hours would become one of the darkest single days any city has ever lived through. Now, before we step into her morning together, let me ask one small favour of you. If a story like this is the kind that quietly gets under your skin, the kind you find yourself still turning over the next day while you're making coffee, then go ahead and tap that subscribe button. Drop a like on your way out, maybe even leave a comment. It costs you nothing, and it helps this little corner of the internet keep telling stories like hers, and I would honestly love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you right now. I look over every single comment, even the short ones. All right, go ahead and dim the lights a little lower if you can manage it. Maybe turn on a fan somewhere in a room, just enough for a soft, steady hum in the background. Get yourself settled, because once we step into 1942, there is no rushing back out. Ready, let's begin. Her name was Maria Chuprina, and before that August morning her life looked almost embarrassingly ordinary. She lived with her mother and her uncle in a small apartment in Stalingrad, a long narrow city that stretched for miles beside the Volga River, almost like it was trying to hug the whole thing. Her father was somewhere far off fighting the German army in Ukraine, which worried her sure, but the war had already been going on for a year by then, and even worry has a strange way of turning into routine if it lasts long enough. Her mother worked as a nurse. Maria went to school when school was in session, and right about now she was likely enjoying the last stretch of her summer holiday, the way kids everywhere do. Half relaxed, half quietly dreading the morning she would have to go back. We do not know a great deal about who Maria was as a person beyond the outline that history happened to leave behind. Whether she was quick to laugh or stubborn or quiet in a crowded room nobody wrote that part down. What we do know is that nothing about her marked her out as someone who was about to become, in her own small way, a witness to history. Which, if you think about it, describes almost everyone who ever lives through something enormous. Nobody feels remarkable while it is actually happening to them. Picture the ordinary rhythm of the city that morning, because it helps to understand just how far it was about to fall. Washing hung on lines strung between apartment buildings. Small boats drifted along the Volga, some fishing, some simply ferrying people back and forth the way boats had done in that exact spot for generations. Market stalls were setting up in the early light. Somewhere a factory whistle sounded calling workers to another ordinary shift. It was by every account an unremarkable summer morning in a city that had so far mostly managed to keep the war at arm's length. Stalingrad itself was not the kind of place most people outside Russia had ever heard of. It was an industrial city full of steel plants and factories stretched along one of the widest, busiest rivers in Europe. Nearly 900,000 people called it home by then, swollen with refugees who had already run from the fighting further west. The city carried the name of the Soviet leader himself, a name handed to it more out of political flattery than anything the place had actually done to earn it. And oddly enough, that name, just a name, was about to matter more than anyone standing in Stalingrad that morning could possibly have guessed. There was something almost poetic about one detail in particular. The city's biggest factory used to build tractors for farms across the entire Soviet Union. That factory had a name too, the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, and by the middle of 1942, it had quietly become one of the country's most important sources of a fast-sloped armour tank that would go on to outproduce and outfight nearly everything Germany could throw against it. But that part of the story comes later. For now, all that mattered was that the same production line that used to feed the country had been retooled almost overnight to help defend it. For a long while, people in Stalingrad had told themselves a version of the same story that everyone tells themselves when danger is still happening somewhere else. The war is bad, yes, but it is over there on someone else's street, in someone else's town. Newspapers reported the German advance the way weather reports mention a storm 3 states away. Distant, real, but not quite real. Maria's family lived comfortably inside that same quiet denial right up until the moment it stopped being true. On the morning of August the 23rd, Maria woke up in the apartment she shared with her mother and uncle. It was an ordinary start. Tea, a little conversation, maybe some light complaining about the heat. She had spent the first year of the war mostly going about her business, worried about her father, sure, but otherwise still just a girl figuring out her own small life, while a much bigger one raged somewhere out past the horizon. And then that afternoon the sky changed. At first nobody thought much of it. The light dimmed the way it does before a storm, and most people simply assumed a bank of clouds had rolled in to block the sun. Maria thought so too. There is something so small and human about that, looking up at the beginning of the worst day of your life and thinking, oh, it might rain later. It was not clouds. The first sign was not even an explosion. It was a low, steady drone filling the sky, hundreds of engines at once growing louder by the second, until there was no mistaking it for weather anymore. It was a German bomber fleet more than 400 aircraft strong, sent under the command of an officer named Wolfram von Richthofen, with orders to erase the city from the map in a single afternoon. And by the time the sun actually went down that night, they very nearly had. The city's air defences, such as they were, fell mostly to a single anti-aircraft regiment, made up largely of young women who had signed up as volunteers and had never actually been trained to fire on aircraft, only on ground targets. Against 400 bombers, there was tragically little they could do. Some of them held their positions anyway straight through the worst of it, because nobody had told them they were allowed to stop. Between roughly 3 in the afternoon and well past midnight, wave after wave of bombers dropped around 1,000 tons of explosives and firebombs across Stalingrad, nearly 1,600 separate bombing runs, one right after another, almost without pause. Most of the city's homes back then were built from wood. They did not stand a chance. Entire streets caught fire within minutes. The oil storage tanks along the riverbank split open and spilled burning fuel straight into the Volga until, according to people who watched it happen, the river itself looked like it was on fire, orange and black smoke rolling 3 miles up into the sky above the city. By the time darkness finally settled over Stalingrad, nearly 40,000 people had lost their lives in a single day. To put that in a way that might actually land properly, that is almost double the number of people who would later die in the far more famous firebombing of Dresden, a raid you have probably heard mentioned in 100 different documentaries. Stalingrad's worst day barely earns a footnote by comparison, and yet it may have been even more brutal. What used to be a functioning city of homes and shops and schoolyards had become something closer to a landscape by nightfall. Skeletal walls, blackened chimneys still standing where wooden houses had simply burned away around them. The smoke did not just rise and drift off either. It hung there heavy and low, refusing to leave for days. She would later call that afternoon the single most frightening thing she ever lived through. And honestly, once you know what happened next, it is not hard to understand why. Down along the riverbank, families were trying to cross to the far side of the Volga on anything that would float small steamers, rowboats, fishing barges, whatever people could find in a hurry. And even out on open water with nowhere left to hide, German fighter planes came down low and fired on the crossings anyway. Mothers lost track of children in the crowd. People slipped beneath the surface and simply did not come back up. It was chaos in the truest, ugliest sense of that word, the kind that does not care who you are or how old or how innocent. Here is a detail that still catches people off guard decades later. Officials in Stalingrad had actually been holding back permission for ordinary citizens to leave the city in the weeks before that bombing worried that a mass evacuation would make it look like the city was giving up before the fighting had even properly begun. It is a decision we're going to come back to later in this story, because its consequences did not end with a single afternoon. Not even remotely. Maria did not run away from the fire. She ran toward it straight to find her mother, who was already doing exactly what nurses do in moments like that, trying to help people the world had just broken. And Maria stayed right there beside her. She kept showing up day after day through months of fighting that had not even properly begun yet. She would not step away from that post until the entire battle for her city was finally brutally over nearly half a year later. I want you to sit with that for just a second before we move forward. A 13-year-old girl who woke up thinking about tea and summer holiday ended that day walking through burning streets helping save strangers, and somehow found the strength to keep doing exactly that for months on end. Not because anyone forced her to be brave, because there was simply nobody else standing there to do it. That one afternoon, August the 23rd, 1942, is where our story really begins. Not with generals or armies or maps covered in little red and black arrows, though we will get to plenty of that soon enough. It begins with an ordinary girl and an ordinary morning shattered by a war machine so massive and so sure of itself that its own commanders were certain nothing on earth could stop it, which leaves us with a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why here? Why did the most powerful war machine Europe had ever built decide that this one city, a city that up until that morning barely mattered to anyone outside its own borders, was worth burning to the ground in a single afternoon? The answer has almost nothing to do with the city itself, and everything to do with the decision made hundreds of miles away, long before that August morning, inside a war room thick with cigarette smoke and folded maps. A decision made by one man who had already convinced himself he could not lose chasing an obsession that oddly enough had less to do with military strategy than it did with a single word on a map. A name. That name belonged to a man Adolf Hitler had never actually met and yet somehow could not stop thinking about. Which tells you something about pride, does it not? Sometimes a fight was never really about the city sitting on the map at all. Sometimes it was about who got to say they broke the man whose name was written across it. To understand how a single city ended up carrying that much weight, we have to rewind a little back to the winter, before when the German army stood near enough to see the towers of Moscow through field glasses, and then simply could not go any further. The cold got there first. So did exhaustion stretch supply lines, and a Soviet counterattack nobody in Berlin had fully planned for. By the time the snow finally began to melt in early 1942, German losses on the Eastern Front already stood well past 1 million men killed wounded, or simply lost to frostbite in temperatures cold enough to freeze fuel lines solid and turn rifle oil into sludge. None of that made it into the newsreels back home, of course. What made it into the newsreels was confident certainty and the promise of one more decisive summer push that would finally truly end things for good. The gap between what German citizens were told and what German soldiers had actually just survived was already by that point enormous. For a war machine that had rolled through most of Europe in a matter of weeks, grinding to a halt outside the enemy's own capital, was not just a military setback. It was a wound to the ego of a regime that had built its entire identity around the idea of being unstoppable. And wounded pride, as it turns out, makes for some remarkably expensive decision-making. But before we get to Hitler's pride, let's talk about something far less romantic and honestly far more important. Oil. Because if you strip away the flags, the speeches, and every grainy photograph of soldiers marching in formation, what actually pushed the German army towards southern Russia in the summer of 1942 had very little to do with glory. It had everything to do with fuel tanks running dry. Here is a detail most documentaries skip right past. Right up until the invasion of the Soviet Union began. In 1941, Germany had actually been importing oil from the very country it was about to attack. Strange but true. Once that supply line vanished overnight, German reserves became a slow-ticking clock. A study conducted in the middle of 1941 found that at the rate the military was burning through fuel, the country would run completely dry within a few short months. Germany needed something like 7 million barrels of oil every single month just to keep its tanks, trucks, and aircraft moving. It was producing barely 5 million. Every month that passed without a new source of crude oil widened that gap a little further. Like a slow leak in a tyre nobody had the parts to patch. Picture running a household on an income that only ever covers most of the bills month after month, and you have got a rough sense of the math the German High Command was quietly staring at. So when the push toward Moscow stalled out in that freezing winter, and the war did not end quickly the way German planners had gambled it would, that fuel problem did not disappear along with the frost. It grew worse. Which meant that by the spring of 1942, Hitler was no longer simply fighting for territory on a map. He was fighting to keep his entire war machine physically capable of moving at all. That is the piece of the puzzle almost nobody remembers, and honestly, it is the piece that explains everything else. In early April of that year, Hitler signed off on a new plan, a sweeping offensive meant to smash Soviet forces across the southern half of the front and drive deep into a mountain region most Americans could not point to on a map. The Caucasus. Down there sat 3 oil-producing regions, Maikop, Grozny and Baku, which together were responsible for something like 84% of all the oil the Soviet Union produced. Take that away from Stalin and you do not just win a battle. You potentially strangle an entire war economy. German planners even gave the operation a name with a strange, almost gentle ring to it. For something this brutal Operation Edelweiss, after the little white mountain flower, and they honestly expected their tanks to be standing in Baku by that November. Hitler said as much plainly to his own senior officers about a month before the offensive began. He told them in essence that without the oil sitting under those mountains, he did not see how Germany could keep fighting the war much longer. That is not the kind of thing a confident commander says lightly, by the way. That is the kind of thing a man says when he already understands somewhere underneath the confidence exactly how much is riding on a single roll of the dice. Not everyone around him shared quite that same certainty for what it is worth. His own army chief of staff, a careful methodical officer named Franz Halder, wrote privately around this same time that the entire outcome of the war might come down to what happened in those oil fields. Now on the surface that sounds like agreement, but if you have ever worked closely with someone who chooses their words that carefully, you learn to hear the difference between excitement and quiet professional dread. Halder's diary reads a lot more like the second one. So where you might be asking, does Stalingrad actually fit into a plan that was really about mountains and oil wells hundreds of miles further south? Good question, and the honest answer might surprise you. Originally it barely fit in at all. Stalingrad sat along the Volga River, which functioned as one of the Soviet Union's most important supply arteries, moving fuel, grain and materials north and south by barge. The initial idea was almost defensive in nature. Push far enough to neutralize the city as a threat guard the flank of the real advance into the Caucasus, and keep moving south toward the actual prize. Nobody in that original April plan was talking about house-to-house combat over every last building in the city. That came later, and it came from a decision that, looking back, probably deserves far more blame for what eventually happened than any single battlefield mistake that followed it. On the 9th of July, Hitler made a change that quietly reshaped the entire war on the Eastern Front. Instead of pushing south with one unified, concentrated force, the way the original plan intended, he split his Southern Army Group in two. One half Army Group A would drive hard into the Caucasus toward the oil fields. The other Army Group B would swing toward Stalingrad and take the city outright, rather than simply neutralizing it from a distance. Both objectives at the same time, with the same limited pool of trucks fuel, and men that had originally been built to chase just one. The disruption did not stop with splitting the army in two either. Within days of that decision, the general placed in charge of the force heading towards Stalingrad, a man named Fedor von Bock, was abruptly removed from command and replaced by another officer, Maximilian von Weichs. One of the most consequential operations of the entire war changed hands in the middle of getting that operation underway. If you have ever started a major project at work only to have your manager swapped out halfway through the kickoff meeting, you have got some idea of how smoothly that tends to go. If you have ever tried to do two big demanding things at once fully, with the same amount of time and energy you would normally give to just one of them, you already have a decent instinct for why this went badly. Military planners have a term for exactly this kind of decision: dividing your strength to chase two prizes instead of fully committing to either. It is a mistake almost as old as warfare itself. More than a century earlier, a different European emperor marched deep into Russia, chasing his own version of an unstoppable victory, only to find that space distance and a stubborn refusal to retreat could undo an army every bit as thoroughly as any battle could. Hitler certainly knew the story of that earlier campaign. Whether he actually absorbed its lesson is at best an open question, and here is where the math turned unkind. Hitler considered the Caucasus oil fields the true prize, so Army Group A received priority on the trucks and fuel that both groups desperately needed. Army Group B, the one racing towards Stalingrad, was left waiting further back in the supply line, its advance slowed by weeks it could not really afford to lose. Every single one of those delayed weeks was a week the Soviet defenders in and around the city did not waste. They used it to dig in, to organize, to prepare for a fight that German planners had originally assumed would barely happen at all. If you ask me, and I realize nobody actually did this, is the exact moment the entire southern campaign quietly slipped out of Germany's hands months before a single German soldier ever set foot inside Stalingrad itself. Wars are rarely lost in the dramatic moment everyone remembers later, the last stand, the final surrender. More often they are lost in a quiet decision made weeks earlier, in a room full of maps and cigarette smoke by people who were certain they had already won. Have you ever watched someone dig in on a call they made not because the facts actually supported it, but because backing down would mean admitting out loud in front of everyone watching that they got it wrong? Keep that feeling in your back pocket for a moment, because we're going to watch that exact instinct play out again and again as this story unfolds on a scale that gets harder and harder to look away from. There is also a second layer to all of this one that has nothing to do with barrels of oil or supply trucks and everything to do with pride. Stalingrad carried the name of the one man Hitler considered his true rival for historical significance. Take Moscow, and you capture a capital. Take a city named directly after Joseph Stalin himself, and you hand your own propaganda ministry a headline capable of echoing across the entire world. The military logic said, guard the flank and keep moving toward the oil. The political logic, the ego-driven headline chasing logic, said something else entirely. Erase the symbol. Make Stalin watch his own name burn. And here is something worth remembering before you assume this obsession with symbolism only ran in one direction. Stalin understood exactly what losing a city carrying his own name would look like, both to the rest of the world and to his own people. Which is part of why later in this story decisions got made on the Soviet side that had just as little to do with pure military logic as anything happening inside the German high command. Pride, it turns out, rarely limits itself to just one side of a river. Most general summaries of this battle tend to skip straight past all of this and jump right to the tanks and the artillery, as if the whole thing was simply inevitable from the start. It was not. It was a choice made by a small handful of men in a room weighing a spreadsheet of barrels and trucks against something far harder to measure ego image and the story a government wanted to tell its own citizens about who was winning. Those two logics did not agree with each other, and inside the German high command plenty of officers quietly understood that. Some of them argued carefully and at real professional risk that grinding an entire army through house-to-house urban combat was exactly the kind of costly attritional fighting that smart commanders were supposed to avoid whenever they had the option. They had studied the previous World War closely enough to know how expensive city fighting could get, how it tended to swallow men and equipment at a rate no open field battle ever could. Their warnings did not change the outcome. In an army built entirely around one man's confidence in his own judgment, warnings tend to travel in only one direction, and it is rarely upward. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would honestly love to hear your answer down in the comments. If you were the officer standing in that room watching your superior split an already stretched army in two, chasing symbolism nearly as much as strategy, would you have said something, or would you have done exactly what nearly every officer in that room actually did, which was stay quiet, follow the order and hope it somehow worked out anyway? By the time we reached the summer of 1942, two very different visions were quietly fighting for control of the exact same military campaign. One version wanted oil resources, the economic strangulation of an enemy that could have reshaped the balance of the entire war. The other version wanted something far less practical and far more personal, a symbolic kill, a name struck from the map, a story Germany could tell itself about who was truly winning this war. As you might already suspect, the second version was about to win out over the first, and an awful lot of ordinary people on both sides of that river were going to pay the price for that particular argument. It is worth sitting with for just a moment how strange this actually is. An entire summer offensive, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, all of it ultimately shaped less by careful strategy and more by one man's need to prove a point to a rival he had never met and never would. History rarely announces itself that plainly. Most of the time, the truly consequential decisions look almost boring from the outside, a signature on a directive, a line added to a map, a meeting that ran a little longer than it should have. Which brings us at last to the man who actually had to carry these orders out. Thousands of miles away from that war room full of maps and cigarette smoke, a general named Friedrich Paulus was reading through fresh instructions that would send his entire army straight out across the open steppe of southern Russia, directly into a decision he had not made, could not undo, and if we are being honest with each other, probably never fully understood the true cost of until it was already far too late to turn back. Paulus did not know it yet, but the summer stretching out ahead of him was about to move faster than almost anything the world had seen in that war so far, and then without warning grind to a dead stop in the dust. His army crossed into the open steppe of southern Russia in the last days of June, and for a while it must have felt less like war and more like a road trip nobody could slow down. Flat land for miles in every direction. Heat that shimmered off the dry grass. Tanks and trucks kicking up dust clouds so thick that pilots overhead sometimes lost sight of their own columns underneath them. The German Sixth Army, along with the armoured spearhead of the 4th Panzer Army beside it, tore across that ground at a pace that visibly startled even their own commanders. Some days they covered more distance than an army twice their size might manage in an entire week. To put the scale of it in perspective, we are talking about roughly 250,000 men in the Sixth Army alone, supported by hundreds of tanks and thousands of trucks moving across open farmland with almost nothing standing between them and the horizon. German officers wrote home that summer, sounding almost giddy, describing endless fields of sunflowers stretching toward the Volga, and villages that offered barely any resistance at all. It is worth remembering for a moment how convincing that must have felt from the inside. If you had been a young officer riding in one of those trucks watching town after town fall without a fight, you would have had every reason to believe the whole campaign might be over before the leaves even started to turn, which, if you think about it, is a very human kind of overconfidence. Have you ever started a new job, breezed through the first couple of weeks without a single real problem, and quietly assumed the whole thing was simply going to stay that easy forever? German officers in July of 1942 were having exactly that feeling, just on a considerably larger and more dangerous scale. On the other side of that dust cloud, the Red Army was not so much retreating as it was unravelling. Whole divisions lost contact with their own command. Roads clogged with refugees, wounded men, and abandoned equipment all moving east, under a sky that German aircraft owned almost completely. Soldiers slept in ditches when they slept, at all ate whatever they could carry, and learned to listen for the particular whine of a strafing run long before they could actually see the aircraft making it. Officers who had commanded confident, disciplined units back in the spring now found themselves simply trying to keep their men moving in the same general direction, let alone in any kind of formation. Cities that Americans have mostly never heard of, places with names like Voroshilovgrad and Rostov-on-Don, fell within days of each other, sometimes with barely a shot fired in their defense. If you have ever watched a group project collapse, the moment the one organized person stops answering messages, you already understand roughly what a modern army looks like when its command structure simply stops functioning. By late July, Rostov-on-Don, a major city guarding the gateway into the Caucasus, had fallen almost without a fight, and that particular collapse landed on Stalin's desk at exactly the wrong moment, because it confirmed something he had feared for weeks. His army was not just losing ground, it was losing the will to hold any ground at all. So on the 28th of July 1942, Stalin signed a document that would go on to shape the rest of this war, more than almost any single battlefield decision that followed it. Officially, it was Order Number 227. Unofficially and far more famously, soldiers came to know it by a much simpler phrase: not one step back. Here is something worth pausing on before we go further. This order was never actually printed in any newspaper. Stalin insisted on that. Instead, it travelled the old-fashioned way, spoken aloud, unit by unit, to soldiers standing in ragged lines, somewhere along hundreds of miles of collapsing front, which means for a moment try to picture it. Exhausted men, half-starved, still covered in the dust of a retreat they did not choose, listening to an officer call out a list of every city they had just lost, and then listening to what came next. Picture the actual scene for a moment, because it helps to understand what this order felt like on the ground rather than just on paper. A political officer standing in front of an exhausted company, unfolding a single sheet of paper by the last light of evening. No printing press, no leaflets handed out, just one man's voice, carrying across a field of men who had marched for days without a proper meal. Some of them would remember decades later exactly where they were standing when they heard it. Most of them would carry it quietly for the rest of their lives, the way people often do with things they lived through, but rarely spoke about out loud afterward. The order did not simply ask men to hold their ground. It declared that any commander who ordered a retreat without direct permission from above was from that moment forward considered a traitor to the country itself. To back that threat up with something more than words, Stalin's order created 2 new instruments of discipline that would follow the Red Army for the rest of the war. The first were penal battalions, units built almost entirely from officers accused of cowardice or panic, stripped of rank and medals, and sent to fight in the most dangerous sectors of the front tasks, like clearing minefields under fire or leading frontal assaults. Nobody else wanted as a chance to, in the language of the order itself, redeem their failure with their own blood. Ordinary soldiers guilty of the same offence were routed into similar penal companies, smaller units of roughly 150 men given the same brutal assignments. The second instrument were blocking detachments, armed units stationed behind the front line with orders to stop by force if necessary any soldier attempting to flee the fighting. There was buried somewhere inside all this brutality a strange kind of escape hatch too. Soldiers assigned to penal units were not necessarily sentenced forever. A serious wound earned in battle, the kind that would keep a man out of action for a while, was often enough to formally atone for whatever mistake had landed him there in the first place, and send him back to a regular unit with his record wiped clean. It did not make the arrangement humane exactly, but it meant the system was built less around permanent punishment and more around extracting one specific thing from every man. It touched a willingness to bleed for a second chance. Over the full stretch of the war, something like 430,000 men would eventually pass through these penal units in one form or another. Roughly half of them would be killed or seriously wounded before earning their way back out. Those are not just statistics sitting on a page somewhere. That is nearly 500,000 individual decisions made by nearly 500,000 different men about whether one panicked instinct in a single terrible moment was worth risking everything that came after it. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, one of the more careful and measured minds inside the Soviet High Command, later called the order one of the most powerful documents to come out of the entire war precisely because of how plainly and painfully it forced everyone to confront exactly how near to collapse things had actually become. That is not the description of a man celebrating cruelty. It is the description of a man admitting years later just how frightened the whole system truly was in that particular summer. Now, if what you are picturing right now is rows of Soviet soldiers being gunned down by their own side in massive numbers, I want to slow down here for a second, because the real picture is messier and in its own strange way more human than that popular image suggests. Internal Soviet records from that autumn tell a slightly different story. Along the Stalingrad front alone between the start of August and the middle of October, restricted forces picked up more than 15,000 soldiers who had fled their positions. Of those, the overwhelming majority, nearly all of them, were simply sent back to their units to keep fighting. A few hundred were shot. A few hundred more were imprisoned. It was not the indiscriminate slaughter that decades of Cold War-era storytelling sometimes made it out to be. It was something closer to a brutal, terrifying filtering system, designed mostly to frighten men back into their trenches rather than execute them outright. That said, and this part matters too, inside the city of Stalingrad specifically, where the fighting eventually grew more desperate than almost anywhere else, on the entire front the numbers tell a harsher story. Some Soviet estimates suggest that over just a few weeks of the worst fighting, more than 10,000 men may have been shot by their own side. Historians still argue over exactly how high that number climbed and how consistently the order was actually enforced from unit to unit. What nobody really disputes is the emotional weight it added to an already unbearable situation. A Soviet soldier standing on the banks of the Volga that autumn was not simply afraid of the German army in front of him. He was afraid of the men behind him too, and if he happened to be an officer, the stakes were even sharper, since a single unauthorized retreat could cost him his rank, his decorations, and his place among the men he used to command. Here is a detail I find almost darkly ironic, and one that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of this order. Look closely at the text of it, and the document itself openly admits where at least part of this idea came from. It points directly to the German army's own methods, describing how German commanders had used similarly harsh measures to restore discipline among their own troops after a difficult retreat the previous winter, and how those methods had apparently worked. In other words, one of the most feared documents of the entire war was, by its own admission, partly inspired by watching the enemy do something similar first. War has a strange way of making enemies copy each other's worst instincts, even while insisting they are nothing alike. And yet, oddly enough, some soldiers who lived through it later describe the order not with pure horror, but with something closer to relief. One veteran, recalling it decades afterward, said that hearing it spoken aloud actually made the men feel steadier, because at least now everyone finally understood exactly where they stood. There is something deeply human buried inside that reaction, even if it makes for uncomfortable listening. When the world around you has completely fallen apart, sometimes even brutal, unforgiving clarity feels better than confusion. Can I ask you something honestly? If you had been standing in that line half-starved, having just retreated from a city you were ordered to defend, and you heard an order like that spoken aloud for the first time, do you think you would have felt afraid, or do you think some small, strange part of you might have actually felt that same sense of relief? It is worth sitting with for a second, because it says something about how people respond to chaos, not just about this particular war. There is no clean answer to that question, and I do not think there is meant to be one. War rarely offers people clean answers. Mostly it offers impossible choices dressed up as simple orders and asks ordinary men to survive, or not somewhere in the gap between the two. Whatever the emotional response, the practical result showed up almost immediately on a map, and it is honestly one of the more satisfying details in this entire chapter of the story. In July, at the very start of the German summer offensive, Paulus's forces had been advancing at a pace measured in dozens of miles a day. By August, that pace had shrunk to just a handful of miles. By September, progress was being counted in mere city blocks, and by October, German officers were reporting an advance of a few dozen paces in a single day as a real reportable success. An army that had once treated distance like an afterthought was now measuring victory in footsteps. German intelligence noticed the shift too, and their own internal assessments tell an almost embarrassing story of changing their minds in real time. In the first days after Stalin's order went into effect, German commanders intercepted word of it, and largely dismissed it, convinced that Soviet resistance was already broken beyond repair, and that no threat of punishment could patch that back together. Barely a week later, those same commanders were sending warnings up their own chain of command that they were now facing something unexpected, a defense that had somehow become organized, stubborn, and disturbingly difficult to break. Whatever Stalin's order actually was, cruel, desperate, effective, or all three at once, it changed how the enemy itself perceived the fight within a matter of days. So by the time Paulus's forces finally reached the outer edges of Stalingrad, they were no longer racing across open ground against a collapsing enemy. They were approaching a city full of soldiers who had just been told in the clearest possible terms that retreating was no longer an option available to them at all. Somewhere beyond the last ridge of dry steppe, past the burned-out remains of villages that had not survived the advance, the rooftops and factory chimneys of the city were finally visibly within reach. Whatever these two armies were about to do to each other inside that city, neither side was going to be allowed to simply walk away from it. And somewhere among those factory walls, among people who had nowhere left to retreat to, even if they had wanted to, an entirely different kind of fighting was about to begin, the kind that turns every staircase, every basement, and every pile of broken brick into its own private battlefield. By the second week of September, the fight for Stalingrad stopped being a story about maps and army groups, and quietly became a story about one man crossing a burning river in the dark because somebody had to. His name was Vasily Chukov, and on the 11th of September 1942, he was handed command of the Soviet 62nd Army, the force now responsible for holding what little remained of the city itself. It is worth remembering that command changes like this were not exactly rare that summer. Soviet generals who lost ground quickly lost their jobs, sometimes their freedom, and occasionally worse. Chuikov's predecessor, a general named Lopatin, had been removed from command only days earlier for what his superiors judged to be a lack of sufficient fight in him. Whatever else you want to say about the Soviet High Command that autumn, they were not exactly generous with second chances. The soldiers Chuikov inherited were not in fighting shape either. After weeks of retreat and bombardment, the army under his command had been worn down to somewhere around 20,000 exhausted men, a fraction of its original strength, propped up by a shrinking handful of tanks and mortars that grew smaller by the day. Chuikov's own colleagues later described him as blunt to the point of rudeness, thick-necked, hard-drinking, and almost entirely uninterested in anyone's opinion of him. Soldiers who served under him would later half-joke that the man seemed to be carved out of the same stone as the ruins he was defending, which, given what was about to happen to that stone, might be the single most fitting description anyone gave him. That same night, Chukov crossed the Volga River into the city under German artillery fire to set up his headquarters, which tells you almost everything you need to know about the kind of commander he intended to be. The crossing itself was no small thing. German artillery observers on high ground had the river measured out with brutal accuracy by that point in the battle, and boats attempting to cross after dark did so almost blind, engines cut low, listening for the whistle of incoming shells rather than trusting their eyes to spot them in time. This was not a general planning a battle from somewhere safe and comfortable miles behind the action. This was a man who had apparently decided that if his soldiers were going to fight and die inside a burning city, the least he could do was breathe the same smoke they were breathing. It is the kind of leadership philosophy that sounds almost reckless written down on paper, and in a lot of ways it was. But in a battle that had already chewed through several officers who tried to run things from a safe distance, showing up in person carried its own kind of weight. Soldiers tend to fight differently for a commander they have actually seen standing in the same mud they are standing in. 2 days later, on the 13th of September, the real fight for the heart of the city began, and it began with two targets that both sides understood, almost instinctively would decide everything that followed. The German plan that morning called for 2 full infantry divisions to punch straight through toward the city centre and the Volga landing stage beyond it, while a third pushed in from the south. On paper, it looked simple enough, the kind of plan a staff officer could sketch out in an afternoon using clean arrows on a clean map. Maps, as it turns out, have a way of looking a great deal tidier than the streets they are meant to represent. The first target was a modest hill on the western edge of the city, one that barely registers on a modern map known to Soviet military planners simply as Height 102. Locals called it Mamiev Kurgan, an old burial mound, and whoever controlled its summit could see and shell almost the entire city stretched out below. The second target was the city's main railway station, a squat brick building that under any normal circumstances would be one of the least remarkable buildings in the entire city. Neither of these places sound on paper like the kind of ground worth dying for, and yet what happened at both of them over the following 72 hours is honestly one of the more staggering details in this entire story, one that still quietly surprises people who think they already know how brutal this battle was. Let's start with the railway station, because the number attached to it is almost hard to say out loud without pausing. On the 14th of September, alone in a single day, that one building changed hands 13 separate times. 13 times! German records from that day actually tracked it almost hour by hour, something like Soviet control at 8:30 in the morning, German control 10 minutes later, Soviet again by mid-morning, German again by early afternoon, and so on back and forth for the better part of a full day. Picture that for a second. Picture fighting hard enough and dying in large enough numbers to capture a building, only to lose it again before lunch, retake it by mid-afternoon, and lose it again before the sun went down. That is not a battle in any conventional sense of the word. That is something closer to a single room being fought over again and again by two exhausted armies who had both apparently decided that giving up was simply no longer an option, available to either of them. Have you ever been in an argument so drawn out and so exhausting that neither side could actually remember anymore what winning was even supposed to look like? Multiply that feeling by several hundred armed men at artillery, and you start to get somewhere near what the inside of that railway station must have felt like that day. Up on Mamiev Kurgan, the fighting was, if anything, even worse. The Soviets had spent weeks turning the hill into a fortress of trenches, barbed wire, and buried mines, and the German 295th Infantry Division paid for every single metre of that slope in blood. When German troops finally did reach the summit, they immediately began using it exactly the way the Soviets had feared, as an artillery spotting post overlooking the entire city and the railway station below it, which meant the hill had to be retaken whatever the cost, and the cost turned out to be almost unspeakable. Decades later, when engineers studied the soil on that hill, they found something almost unbelievable. Packed into every single square metre of earth were somewhere between 500 and 1,200 fragments of metal shrapnel shell casings and bullet fragments, the leftover debris of months of constant shelling. For years afterward, almost nothing green would grow there. The ground itself had essentially been poisoned by the sheer volume of iron buried inside it. The unit given the job of retaking the hill was the 13th Guards Rifle Division, roughly 10,000 men under a commander named Alexander Rodimtsev, and their journey into the battle alone deserves a moment of its own. They crossed the Volga River that same night under heavy German fire in small boats and ferries, watching the water around them light up with shell fire, while men beside them simply did not make it to the other bank. Within their first 24 hours of actual combat inside the city, this single division suffered casualties estimated at around 30%. By the time the fighting for Stalingrad finally ended months later, only around 320 of those original 10,000 men were still standing. Sit with that number for a moment. 10,000 men crossed that river in the dark to retake a hill. Roughly 3% of them lived to see the battle's end, and the 13th Guards were hardly alone in making that crossing. Night after night throughout September, fresh Soviet units ferried across the Volga, under fire in whatever boats, barges or fishing craft could still float to replace the men who had fallen the day before. It became its own grim rhythm to the battle, a nightly transfusion of fresh blood into a wound that never seemed to stop bleeding. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to turn a number like the one I just gave you into just another grim statistic and move on the way a lot of documentaries tend to do. But 320 men is not an abstraction. That is 320 specific human beings who happen to survive something that by every reasonable measure they should not have. And it is roughly 9,680 who did not each one of them somebody's son, husband, or father, reduced now to a single line in a casualty report that most people will never look at twice. It was not only the Soviet side feeling the strain of fighting like this either. German soldiers wrote home that autumn describing something closer to disbelief than confidence. One young private describing the city to his family said it reminded him less of the fast-moving war he had trained for, and more of an older, uglier kind of fighting the trench warfare his own father might have described from a battlefield decades earlier, except now armed with far deadlier weapons. That comparison alone should tell you something. An army built entirely around speed and momentum had stumbled into precisely the kind of fighting it was never designed to survive. To understand what fighting for a single building actually meant that September, you have to let go of almost everything a typical war movie has taught you about combat. This was not soldiers charging across open ground toward a clearly defined enemy position. This was crawling through shattered stairwells in the dark, never entirely sure whether the room on the other side of a blown-out wall held a fellow soldier or an enemy soldier near enough to reach out and touch. Floors of the same building sometimes belonged to opposite armies at the same time, Germans holding the ground level. Soviets dug into the floor directly above them, both sides tossing grenades through holes in the ceiling rather than risk the stairs. Chuikov himself was not spared the chaos either, and honestly this is one of my favourite small details in the whole story, because it says so much about how near command and combat actually were inside that city. His own headquarters on Mamayev Kurgan came under such heavy bombardment that he was forced to abandon it and relocate to a bunker cut into a nearby ravine practically underneath the city itself. This was the general in charge of the entire defence, and even he could not find a spot inside Stalingrad that was actually safe. There was no rear area anymore. There was no safe command post tucked away from the fighting. Every single square foot of that city for both armies had become the front line. There is a building from this same stretch of fighting that still exists today, if you can believe that, and I think it says more about this battle than almost any statistic could. It was once a flour mill owned by a local family named Gerhardt, sitting near the centre of the city. Soviet troops fought street by street, floor by floor to hold it, and by the time the fighting for it finally ended, the mill had been reduced to a hollow bullet-scarred shell of brick and twisted metal. After the war, when the rest of the city was rebuilt from the ground up, officials made a deliberate choice to leave that one building exactly as the fighting had left it, untouched, unrepaired, standing today almost exactly as it looked in 1942. Visitors who walk through the memorial complex built around it now can still run a hand over brick, pockmarked with bullet holes more than 80 years old, and get a small physical sense of something that numbers on a page can never quite deliver. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, and I would love to know what you think. Both sides, German and Soviet, kept pouring men into buildings that from any reasonable military standpoint were not actually worth what they cost to take. A train station is not a strategic prize on its own. A flour mill does not win a war by itself. So why do you think both armies kept fighting so hard over such small, unremarkable pieces of ground? Is it really about the ground itself at this point, or does a fight like this eventually take on a logic all its own, one that has almost nothing left to do with maps or supply lines and everything to do with two sides, who have simply decided that backing down is no longer something either of them knows how to do anymore, I think about that kind of stalemate more than you might expect for someone who mostly researches events that happened decades before I was born. Wars like people have a strange tendency to lose sight of their own original reasons the longer they drag on. What starts as a fight over oil fields and a name on a map slowly narrows down building by building, till it becomes a fight simply because stopping now would mean admitting that everything already lost was lost for nothing. That is a very human trap, and it is not one that only shows up on battlefields, because that more than any single order or directive from either capital is really what defined the next stretch of this story. This was not chess anymore, with generals calmly moving pieces across a board from somewhere safe. This had become something closer to two exhausted fighters, both bleeding badly, both too stubborn or too frightened to let go of each other, grappling in the wreckage of a city that neither side had originally cared much about at all. And the truly unsettling part is that what happened in those first days around the railway station and that hill was still in a strange way only the opening act. Because further north, past the smoking ruins of the city centre, where steel plants and machine shops once produced tools and tractors instead of weapons, an entirely new and even more brutal kind of fighting was about to take shape. It would draw in fresh divisions, fresh commanders, and a level of relentless, sustained violence that even the men who had just survived the fight for that railway station were not fully prepared for. It was so strange, so different from anything either army had trained for that the Germans themselves would eventually have to invent a completely new word just to describe what fighting inside Stalingrad actually felt like. The word the Germans eventually settled on was Rattenkrieg, rat war. And once you understand why they chose it, you stop thinking of Stalingrad as a battle in the traditional sense at all, and start thinking of it as something closer to an infestation that both armies were simultaneously trying to fight and become. That word did not even exist in the German language before this battle. Some anonymous soldier or officer standing in the middle of it all had to actually invent it, because nothing in the existing military vocabulary of 1942 came anywhere near describing what this had turned into. There is something almost poetic in the darkest possible sense about an army that had spent years perfecting the vocabulary of speed terms like lightning war encirclement, and breakthrough being forced to invent an entirely new word just to describe standing still and slowly bleeding. German soldiers of all people were the ones who came up with a grim little joke to describe what fighting inside that city actually felt like, and it captures the absurdity of it better than any official report ever could. They would capture the kitchen of an apartment, they said, and still be fighting for the living room. Sometimes they would hold the living room too, and still be fighting for the bedroom. An entire war condensed down into the floor plan of a single ordinary home. If you have ever renovated a house room by room and felt like the project would simply never end, you have a very small, very safe taste of the feeling these men were describing, minus, of course, the part where someone is trying to kill you through the drywall. So how do you actually fight a war like that? How do you organize an army meant for open plains and fast-moving tanks into something that can survive a fight measured in stairwells and kitchen doorways? The answer came from Zhukov, and it turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple once you heard it explained, even though putting it into practice cost an enormous number of lives. He called it hugging the enemy. The idea was this: if Soviet soldiers kept their positions near enough to the Germans, sometimes within actual grenade throwing range, the German army's two biggest advantages, its air power and its artillery, became almost useless. Neither the Luftwaffe nor German gun crews could safely hit Soviet positions without also hitting their own men standing a few meters away. Zhukov had essentially figured out how to take Germany's greatest strength and turn it into something the German army could no longer safely use at all. It is the kind of insight that sounds obvious once somebody says it out loud, and yet somebody still had to be the first person willing to say it. There is a certain dark elegance to it too if you allow yourself to appreciate tactics the way a chess player might appreciate a particularly ruthless opening move. Germany had spent years building the most technologically advanced military machine on the planet, full of dive bombers and heavy artillery. Chuikov's answer was not to build something bigger or better. It was simply to stand near enough that Germany could no longer safely use any of it. His men by most accounts respected him for it, even if respect might be too gentle a word for what they actually felt. Soldiers under his command nicknamed him General Stubbornness, which honestly might be the most accurate military title handed out during the entire war. He was also, according to more than one account from the period, hard to miss in a crowd, thanks to a wide, confident smile full of gold-crowned teeth that apparently unsettled friend and enemy alike. Picture that for a second. A general who smiles at his own soldiers with a mouthful of gold standing in the middle of a burning city, refusing point blank to consider the idea of losing it. It is the kind of detail no screenwriter would dare invent because it would sound too on the nose, and yet there it is sitting quietly in the historical record. By the final days of September, Chuikov had turned hugging the enemy into an entire philosophy of combat, one built around what came to be known as storm groups. These were small teams, sometimes as few as half a dozen men, sometimes closer to a full platoon built to slip into a single contested building, rather than charge an entire city block the way traditional infantry doctrine would normally suggest. A typical storm group split itself into two parts. One small team armed with submachine guns and satchel charges was tasked with actually breaking into the building and clearing it room by room. A second team hung back just far enough to provide covering fire and to rush forward as reinforcements the moment the first team ran into serious trouble, which in this particular city happened rather often. Inside the target building itself, soldiers were often paired off with what amounted to a single fighting partner, someone they stuck beside for the entire operation, watching each other's back through doorways and stairwells, where a moment's inattention could easily be fatal. Officers, sergeants, and ordinary privates fought shoulder to shoulder in these small groups, rank meaning considerably less than it once had, back when this had still resembled a conventional war. These groups did not always walk in through the front door either, if there even was a front door left standing. Stalingrad sat on top of an extensive network of sewers, drainage tunnels, and underground utility lines, and once Soviet soldiers figured out how to use them, those tunnels became one of the most effective weapons in their entire arsenal. Small teams would crawl through pipes barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, pop up somewhere behind German lines and strike from a direction nobody was watching. Combine that with a habit of attacking mostly at night when tired. Sleep-deprived German soldiers were at their most rattled, and you start to understand why an army that had steamrolled across half a continent in a matter of weeks suddenly found itself pinned down by soldiers it could barely even see coming. German commanders were not blind to what was happening, and they tried adapting in turn. They organized their own smaller assault teams equipped with machine guns, light mortars, and flamethrowers, designed specifically to clear cellars, bunkers, and the very sewer tunnels the Soviets had been using so effectively. It helped to a degree, but every adaptation the Germans made simply dragged the fighting further into exactly the kind of grinding tight quarters combat that favoured the defenders, the very trap Chukov had built in the first place. Can I ask you something? Have you ever been kept up worrying about a problem you could hear but not actually locate a strange sound in the walls of a house at night? Something scratching somewhere just out of sight. That low-grade constant unease is not a bad way to imagine what it felt like to be a German soldier holding a building in Stalingrad, that autumn never quite certain whether the enemy was in front of you, behind you, or somewhere underneath your own boots. By late September, the fighting had also begun shifting north away from the city centre and toward an entirely different kind of battlefield, one built not out of apartment blocks and train stations, but out of heavy industry. 3 enormous factories dominated this stretch of the city: the Stalingrad tractor factory, the Red October steel plant and the Barricadi arms factory, and together they became the site of some of the single most concentrated violence of the entire battle. These were not small buildings. These were sprawling industrial complexes full of furnaces, conveyor systems, and half-assembled machinery offering hundreds of separate rooms, catwalks and hiding places for exactly the kind of room-by-room fighting Chuikov's storm groups had already perfected downtown. Soldiers fought among half-finished tank hulls still sitting on the assembly line ducked behind furnaces that had only months earlier been forging ploughshares instead of artillery shells, and used massive spools of industrial cable as makeshift barricades. It must have been a strange, almost dreamlike kind of violence, killing and dying inside a building built entirely for the quiet, repetitive business of manufacturing. To put the overall scale of this fight in perspective for a moment, by this stage of the battle, the German Sixth Army numbered somewhere around 250,000 men backed by hundreds of tanks and well over 1,000 aircraft. Chuikov's entire 62nd Army, the force actually holding the city against that weight, numbered barely 50,000 men, at any given point resupplied only by whatever could survive the crossing of the Volga each night. On paper, this should not have been a fight that lasted more than a few days. On the 14th of October, the Germans launched what would become their single most intense assault of the entire battle, throwing 2 full divisions directly at the tractor factory, while a third attacked from the south. Chuikov himself, a man who had by that point lived through weeks of relentless combat, later called it the worst day of the entire fight for the city. By his own estimate, something near 3,000 German soldiers were killed in the fighting around that one factory complex on that single day alone. 3,000 men for control of a building that only a year earlier had been rolling tractors off an assembly line for farms hundreds of miles away. There is something almost surreal about the scale of firepower Germany eventually threw at this fight too, and I think this detail gets overlooked more than almost anything else in the story. At one point, German forces actually brought in a colossal, railway-mounted artillery piece nicknamed Dora, one of the largest guns ever constructed by any army in human history, originally built to help crack open heavily fortified concrete defences guarding entire national borders. This particular gun fired shells that weighed several tons apiece, and required a small army of engineers and rail crews just to move and operate it. Bringing a weapon of that scale to bear on tight quarters, urban fighting is a little like showing up to a bar fight with a battleship. Remarkably, part of that same factory complex would eventually be rebuilt after the war, and continued producing steel for decades afterward, workers walking daily across ground that had once been soaked with the blood of thousands of soldiers from both armies, likely with only the faintest sense of exactly what had happened beneath their feet. It is worth stepping back here for a moment, because a detail like that says something larger about how this entire battle actually worked. All the strategy in the world, all the enormous guns and the careful planning back in Berlin, eventually collapsed down into something almost tribal. In its simplicity, 2 exhausted groups of young men fighting over a doorway with whatever object happened to be closest to hand. War, it turns out, has a way of stripping away every layer of sophistication a modern army spends decades building, until what is left underneath looks almost exactly like it did 1,000 years ago. And the human cost of all this, by the way, is not something I want to gloss over with vague language, because I think the actual number deserves to land with its full weight. According to widely cited figures from the period, a newly arrived Soviet soldier sent into Stalingrad that autumn had an average life expectancy of roughly 24 hours. Officers, thanks to slightly better information and slightly more caution, could sometimes expect to survive about 3 days. 24 hours. Think about everything you might normally do in a single day. Wake up, eat something, talk to a few people, maybe complain about the weather. For an enormous number of young men who crossed that river into the city that autumn, an entire ordinary day's worth of small human moments was quite literally all the time they had left. If you had 24 hours left and you somehow knew it, even if nobody around you said so out loud, what do you think you would spend that time thinking about? I'm not sure there is a comfortable answer to that question, and maybe that is exactly the point. I do not say any of this to be needlessly grim. I say it because I think it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, rather than letting a number that large simply slide past unnoticed, the way statistics so often do. 24 hours is not an abstraction. It is a single sunrise and a single sunset, and for thousands of ordinary men that autumn, it turned out to be the entire remaining length of their lives. Somewhere inside all of this chaos, though, something unexpected started to happen too, something that in its own strange way gave the exhausted defenders of this city a reason to believe they might actually survive it. Ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, teenagers barely out of school began doing things inside these ruins that verged on the unbelievable, holding single buildings against impossible odds, for weeks at a time, becoming almost by accident the kind of legend soldiers tell each other about to stay sane during the worst nights of a war. One of those buildings in particular would go on to become so famous that it still gets studied in military academies today, an ordinary 4-story apartment block that under a stubborn young sergeant with almost nothing left to fight with, somehow refused to fall for nearly 2 straight months. That story, and the story of the men who managed to hold that building against everything Germany could throw at it, deserves its own space to breathe properly. So let's slow down for a moment and step inside those walls next, because what happened there might be one of the most remarkable acts of defiance in the entire history of this war, and by the time you hear the full account, I suspect you will understand why it did not need a single word of exaggeration to sound almost too extraordinary to believe. His name was Yakov Pavlov, and on the morning of the 27th of September 1942, he was 24 years old, holding the rank of junior sergeant, and about to become the reluctant centre of one of the most famous stories to come out of the entire war, whether he actually wanted that or not. The mission that morning sounded almost routine on paper. A small platoon of 30 men was ordered to cross a wide exposed square and retake a 4-story apartment building the Germans had just seized, a building that overlooked the square and a stretch of the Volga River bank just a few hundred meters beyond it. Both the lieutenant and the senior sergeants who should have led that mission were already dead or wounded by that point in the fighting, which is the only reason a junior sergeant like Pavlov ended up in command at all. By the time the survivors actually reached the building, 26 of those 30 men were gone. Pavlov crossed that square with a small handful of soldiers left, standing, cleared the building room by room and held it entirely alone for 2 full days before any help arrived. Try to imagine that for a moment. A handful of men in a shattered building in a city that had already swallowed so many others, with no idea whether help would arrive within the hour or never arrive at all. Every sound outside might be a German patrol probing the perimeter, or it might be nothing. 2 days is not a long stretch of time to wait for reinforcements under normal circumstances. Under those particular circumstances, I imagine it felt considerably longer. The square itself carried its own weight of history, by the way, one worth pausing on for a moment. It was named after the 9th of January, a date that decades earlier referred back to a massacre of unarmed protesters outside the Tsar's palace in St. Petersburg, an event Russians called Bloody Sunday. So this building, the one about to become a symbol of stubborn Soviet resistance, sat overlooking a square already named for one of the darkest days in the country's modern memory. History has an odd way of stacking its tragedies directly on top of one another sometimes. Reinforcements did eventually arrive, a machine gun platoon of somewhere between 20 and 30 men, under a lieutenant named Ivan Afanasyev, bringing anti-tank rifles and mortars with them. And here is a detail I truly love about this particular story, one that rarely makes it into the shorter, tidier retellings. The men who ended up defending that building were not simply Russians fighting Germans in some neat, simple narrative of two nations at war. They came from all across the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, a Georgian, an Uzbek, a Kazakh, a Tajik, an entire patchwork of backgrounds and languages thrown together inside one crumbling building with a single shared immediate purpose. Whatever differences might have mattered to these men back home, none of it mattered anymore once the shelling started. Have you ever noticed how the people who show up for you in the worst moments of your life are rarely the ones you would have predicted beforehand? That is very much what this building became. Proof of an idea larger than any single soldier's story that shared danger has a way of erasing distinctions. People otherwise spend their whole lives insisting matter. They turn that building into something closer to a small self-sufficient fortress than an actual home. Machine guns were positioned to cover every possible approach. Anti-tank rifles went up onto the roof, and this is where the defenders stumbled onto a small but crucial tactical advantage. When a German tank pulled in tight against the base of the building, its main gun physically could not tilt high enough to hit the upper floors, which meant that from the roof, with a rifle designed originally to punch through much thinner armour, Pavlov's men could pick apart tanks that were in every other sense completely safe from that kind of weapon. Sometimes the simplest tactical insights are the ones nobody bothers to write into the official manual, because on paper they sound almost too obvious to mention. It is the kind of advantage that only reveals itself to people actually standing inside the problem, rather than studying it from a safe distance on a map somewhere far behind the lines. Barbed wire and mines went down around the building under cover of darkness. Tunnels were dug beneath the street connecting the building back to Soviet lines, allowing fresh ammunition and eventually fresh soldiers to move in and out without crossing that exposed square in daylight. And remarkably hiding in the basement of this fortified ruin, there were civilians too, people who had never managed to evacuate the city, sheltering directly beneath the fighting happening on the floors above them. One of those civilians, in fact, was born right there in that basement in the middle of the siege. A baby girl. Her name was Zinaida Andreeva, and she survived the entire ordeal thanks largely to the soldiers defending the building above her men, who apparently considered every single one of the civilians hiding down there their own personal responsibility to protect. She would grow up thinking of those defenders in her own words later in life, almost like godfathers. There is something quietly remarkable about that image, a new life beginning in the safest corner its parents could find directly beneath some of the most violent fighting of the entire 20th century. Life inside the building for the fighters themselves was almost unimaginably harsh. They slept in short shifts, if they slept at all, on old insulation or bare floorboards, while German shelling made sure nobody ever really rested. Food came in whatever quantities the tunnels could carry, which was rarely enough. One survivor, recalling the ordeal decades later as an adult, remembered soldiers mixing soil into whatever grain they could scrape together, just to stretch the bread a little further. A detail that tells you almost everything you need to know about how thin the margins for survival had become inside that building. By some accounts, after the worst of the fighting, defenders occasionally had to step outside briefly, just to clear away the bodies of German soldiers that had piled up against the building, because the wall of corpses was blocking their own line of sight for the next assault. I will not dwell on that image longer than necessary, but I think it deserves at least a moment of acknowledgement because it says something honest about what this kind of warfare actually looked like, stripped of any romantic gloss. The building held from the 27th of September all the way through to the 25th of November, nearly 60 days in total, until a Soviet counterattack finally relieved the exhausted garrison. German maps from the period apparently stopped labelling it as an ordinary address entirely and simply marked it as a fortress instead. And General Chuikov himself, the same blunt gold-toothed commander we talked about earlier, would later say that this one small group of defenders killed more enemy soldiers holding that single building than Germany lost during its entire invasion of France 2 years earlier. I want to be honest with you about that particular comparison. It is a dramatic quotable line, exactly the kind of thing that spreads well in a wartime newspaper, and it may well be more of a rhetorical flourish than a precise military accounting. But even if the exact numbers do not hold up perfectly under careful examination, the underlying point still stands. A tiny handful of exhausted, half-starved men held a single building against the full weight of a modern army for nearly 2 months. And here is where I think this story earns a little extra credit for honesty rather than less. In recent years, historians digging back through German archives have noticed something curious. The scale of fighting German records describe around this particular building does not always match the scale of the legend that grew up around it afterward. Some researchers now believe the assaults on the building, while certainly real, may have been less frequent and less intense than Soviet wartime propaganda eventually made them out to be. It is also worth knowing that Pavlov himself only commanded the defence for its first 3 days before Lieutenant Afanasyev took over actual command for most of the siege that followed, which means technically calling it Pavlov's house might not even be entirely fair to the man who did most of the actual work. But by the time the war ended, the name had already stuck, and it has remained stuck for more than 80 years since. I do not think that complicates the story in a bad way, by the way. If anything, I think it makes it more human. Wars produce real heroism constantly, but the specific stories that get remembered are often shaped just as much by who happened to be telling them afterward as by what actually happened in the moment. Keep that thought in your back pocket for a second, because we are about to meet another legend from this exact same battle, one built around a single unforgettable duel between 2 expert marksmen, and it turns out that story might be even less reliable than this one. His name was Vasily Zaitsev, a young man who had grown up hunting in the Ural Mountains with his grandfather, long before the war ever gave him a reason to point a rifle at another human being. Once he arrived in Stalingrad in September, his accuracy quickly set him apart from ordinary infantry, and he was funneled into sniper duty almost immediately. Working with a spotting partner named Kulikov, Zaitsev developed a system he called his 6's 3 separate pairs, each one a shooter and a spotter positioned to watch overlapping fields of fire, so that no single blind spot in the ruins ever stayed unwatched for long. It was less about being the fastest or flashiest shot in the army, and more about simple, relentless patience. Probably the very same instinct that had once helped a boy in the Ural Mountains track game through fresh snow without ever announcing his presence. According to official Soviet figures, he was credited with 225 confirmed kills during the battle, though some later, less carefully verified accounts push that number considerably higher. The story that made Zaitsev famous across the entire Soviet Union, though, was not really about the number of kills at all. It was about one specific opponent, a supposed German master sniper named Meyer Koenig, said to run an elite sniper school back in Berlin, personally dispatched by German high command with a single mission hunt down and eliminate Zaitsev. According to Zaitsev's own later account, the two men stalked each other for days across a shattered stretch of no man's land until Zaitsev finally tricked his opponent into revealing his position and killed him with a single decisive shot. It is a fantastic story. It has been retold in books and documentaries and eventually in a major feature film. There's just one small problem with it. Historians who have gone back through German military records' personnel files, kept with almost obsessive precision throughout the war, have never found a single trace of an officer named Major Koenig, nor any evidence that Germany had a sniper school operating in Berlin at that particular point in the war at all. Even Zaitsev's own account contains small inconsistencies. According to his telling, his opponent was struck down just as sunlight caught the glass of his rifle scope. But for that detail to make physical sense, his opponent would have needed to be facing directly into a setting sun that was according to the actual layout of the two front lines, that autumn sitting behind him rather than in front of him. It is a small detail, the kind of thing a novelist might overlook, and a careful historian would catch almost immediately. So where did the story actually come from? The most likely answer says something fascinating about how wartime propaganda works. A journalist named Vasily Grossman spent time following Zaitsev around the ruins of the city, and Grossman by every account was an unusually gifted writer. A country absorbing millions of casualties needed heroes. It could hold on to figures whose courage felt almost mythic rather than merely statistical. Whether the duel happened exactly as described, happened in a smaller, less dramatic form, or never happened at all, it served an important purpose regardless, giving an exhausted, terrified population something to believe in during the darkest stretch of the entire war. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Does it actually take anything away from Zaitsev's real courage to learn that one specific story about him might have been exaggerated, or does it just mean the truth was already remarkable enough on its own, and somebody along the way decided remarkable simply was not quite enough, because the truth, even without the duel, is still extraordinary in its own right? Snipers, hundreds of them on the Soviet side, including a significant number of women trained specifically for this kind of patient, precise fighting, spent months hidden in rubble water pipes and collapsed buildings, turning ordinary rifles into one of the most psychologically effective weapons of the entire battle. German soldiers wrote home describing real fear of moving even a few feet in daylight, never certain whether an unseen pair of eyes somewhere in the ruins had already found them. You did not need an invented duel with an invented major to make that kind of warfare terrifying. The reality on its own did the job perfectly well. What both of these stories, Pavlov's building and Zaitsev's rifle, actually reveal once you set the legend aside and look underneath it, is something a little more interesting than simple heroism. They show a defending army that had almost nothing left except sheer stubbornness, turning that stubbornness into an actual weapon room by room, rooftop by rooftop, bullet by patient bullet. And while these men were fighting building to building above ground, an entirely different kind of suffering was unfolding all around them, one that had nothing to do with heroics or legends at all. A much quieter, much colder kind of battle against hunger, exhaustion, and the simple grinding difficulty of staying alive for one more day inside a city that no longer had anything resembling ordinary life left in it. That quieter battle did not care whether you were a decorated sniper or a nameless private freezing in a basement somewhere. It came for everyone in that city equally, and it deserves its own honest telling. Somewhere among all the grenades and rooftop duels and legendary standoffs, it becomes easy to forget that most soldiers inside Stalingrad were not fighting a dramatic cinematic battle at all. Most of them were simply trying to survive one more freezing, filthy, hungry day against an enemy that never once had to fire a single shot to hurt them. There is a young German private whose diary survived the war, a man named Wilhelm Hoffmann, and going through his entries in order feels less like studying history from a safe distance, and more like watching a man's confidence quietly drain out of him in real time. On the 11th of September, his tone still carries a kind of grim swagger. His battalion is fighting in the suburbs, he writes fire and flame everywhere, and he describes the Soviet gun crews still resisting from inside the burning city as fanatics, the word of a soldier who still believes on some level that this resistance is simply irrational and that reason, meaning his own side, will eventually win out. 5 days later, on the 16th of September, that tone has already curdled into something nearer to disbelief. His unit is attacking a massive grain elevator on the edge of the city, and he no longer describes the defenders inside it as soldiers at all. He calls them devils, the kind no bullet or flame seems able to destroy. 2 days after that, on the 18th, the fighting is still grinding on inside that same building, and Hoffmann writes something bordering on a quiet, private admission of dread, that if every building in this city gets defended the way this one has, none of them are ever getting home. Put those 3 entries side by side and you can actually watch the psychological floor shift underneath a confident young soldier in the space of about a week. That grain elevator, by the way, deserves its own moment of recognition, because it rarely gets one. It was not glamorous. It did not have a clever nickname or a legendary sniper attached to it. It was just an enormous concrete structure built to store wheat, defended so fiercely that German troops eventually needed several additional days and considerable additional blood just to take a building that technically held almost nothing of direct military value inside it. A handful of Soviet defenders cut off and surrounded held out inside that structure for the better part of a week, drinking water wrung from damp grain dust because there was nothing else, and by the time it finally fell, the men who took it apparently walked away with a grudging, uneasy respect for whoever had just made them pay so heavily for a warehouse. There is a sensory detail that rarely makes it into any retelling of this battle, and I think it deserves at least one sentence of its own. By this point in the fighting, the air itself inside the city had become something almost unbreathable, thick with smoke that never fully cleared the sharp chemical bite of spent explosives, and underneath all of it the unmistakable smell of decomposition that no amount of distance or time seemed able to fully wash away. Soldiers on both sides described eventually losing much of their sense of smell, entirely less because of any physical injury, and more because the mind mercifully simply stopped registering something so constant and so overwhelming. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What does it say about an army? Any army, when soldiers start describing their enemy not as brave or skilled or determined, but as something less than human, something demonic. I think it says less about the enemy and more about the soldier doing the describing, a mind reaching for any available explanation, no matter how irrational, rather than simply accepting that ordinary human beings were choosing again and again not to give up. Because the truth is that both sides, German and Soviet, were fighting something far more patient than each other that autumn, an enemy that did not care about rank, nationality or ideology at all. Disease moved through both armies with a kind of quiet, relentless efficiency that no amount of courage could really defend against. Dysentery, typhus, diphtheria, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Doctors on both sides of the front line, working out of basements and bombed-out hospital wards, truly feared a full-blown epidemic breaking out among troops already weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition. War tends to get remembered through its explosions. It rarely gets remembered through its coughing fits, its fevers, and its quiet, undramatic deaths in overcrowded field hospitals. But those deaths were just as real, and there were a great many of them. Behind the front lines, medical staff on both sides were fighting their own exhausting, largely unrecorded battle. Nurses worked in cellars lit by whatever candle stubs or oil lamps they could find, treating wounds with dwindling supplies of bandages and anaesthetic, sometimes reduced to reusing dressings that under any normal peacetime standard should have been discarded immediately. Doctors performed amputations by lantern light, aware that infection was often a greater threat to a wounded man than the original injury had been. None of these people show up in the dramatic parts of this story. Almost none of them have statues. But an enormous number of soldiers who did eventually make it home again owed that survival entirely to someone whose name history simply never bothered to record. Soldiers' letters home on both sides rarely captured the full truth of any of this, and that was rarely an accident. German military censors looked over outgoing mail before it ever left the front, trimming out anything that might damage morale back home, while Soviet soldiers understood without needing to be told twice exactly which details were wise to leave out of a letter that would eventually cross a censor's desk too. So the actual texture of daily survival, the lice, the disease, the exhaustion mostly travelled home, only in careful euphemism if it travelled home at all. Families on both sides spent the war imagining a version of the front line considerably cleaner than the one their sons were actually living inside, and yet soldiers find strange resourceful ways to hold on to their sanity in circumstances like this, and the men defending Stalingrad were no exception. Soviet accounts describe soldiers passing around scraps of music harmonicas, half-remembered songs from home, black humour, traded between exhausted friends, small rituals of ordinary kindness, sharing the last of a cigarette, checking on a wounded comrade one more time before sleep, anything that offered a brief private reminder that they were still human beings and not simply targets waiting for their turn. It is a small, stubborn kind of defiance, and I find something quietly moving about it. The idea that even here, in the worst place imaginable, people kept finding tiny, deliberate ways to hold on to their own humanity. And then there were the rats. I know, given everything we have already talked about regarding the nickname the Germans gave this entire style of fighting, it feels almost too perfectly ironic to be true, but the literal, actual rodents living inside the ruins of Stalingrad became a serious military problem in their own right. They thrived in the wreckage, feeding on whatever they could find, and at least on one documented occasion, mice chewed straight through the electrical wiring inside German tanks parked in the city, disabling vehicles that were needed for a counterattack at precisely the moment they were needed most. Try explaining that one to a general back in Berlin. Your armoured counterattack failed not because of enemy resistance, but because rodents ate the wiring. War has a way of humbling even the most technologically advanced military machine on the planet with something as small and unglamorous as a mouse. Police were everywhere, too burrowing into uniforms. Nobody had the water or the opportunity to properly wash, and flies swarmed constantly around whatever makeshift kitchens either army managed to set up, landing on food, landing on open wounds, spreading infection to injuries that under any normal circumstances might have healed cleanly. Clean water itself became nearly a luxury. Soldiers on both sides frequently found themselves drinking from shell craters and puddles, water that had almost certainly been sitting there long enough to collect its share of dirt ash, and worse, simply because there was nothing else available, and thirst does not particularly care about hygiene. Food, meanwhile, was never abundant for anyone even in these earlier months of the fighting, well before the far more severe shortages that were still to come later in this story. German supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles back across open steppe that Soviet forces harassed constantly, while Soviet soldiers inside the city depended entirely on whatever could survive a nightly crossing of the Volga under artillery fire. Neither side was eating particularly well. Both sides, in their own different ways, were already learning to treat hunger as simply one more permanent condition of daily life, the way you might treat cold feet, or a persistent headache something you stopped mentioning because mentioning it changed nothing. It was not only soldiers absorbing this particular kind of suffering either. Civilians who remained trapped inside the ruins, and there were still a considerable number of them scattered through basements and cellars across the city, faced their own desperate scramble for food. In some documented cases, it was actually children who were sent out to forage through the rubble for anything edible, precisely because their smaller size let them slip through gaps and narrow spaces that grown adults could not easily manage. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in that landscape of burning tank hulls and collapsed apartment blocks, there were children treating scavenging for scraps of food as simply an ordinary part of their day, the same way a child in peacetime might treat walking the family dog or taking out the trash. I want to slow down on that image for a second because I think it is easy to let a detail like that slide past without really absorbing it. We have spent a good amount of time in this story talking about soldiers, generals, and legendary snipers, and rightly so, their choices shaped what happened here. But somewhere underneath all of that, ordinary children were quietly learning to survive inside a landscape that no child anywhere should ever have to learn to navigate. If you have children in your own life, or if you simply remember being one yourself, I think that detail lands somewhere a little different than a casualty statistic ever could. There is a psychological dimension to all of this too, one that modern doctors would now recognize immediately, even though nobody fighting inside Stalingrad in 1942 had a name for it yet. Soldiers on both sides were absorbing a level of sustained brutal violence combined with hunger filth and constant fear that we now understand causes lasting damage to the human mind, not just the human body. German soldiers, most of them thousands of miles from anything familiar, surrounded by a language they did not speak, and a landscape that offered no comfort at all, seemed to have suffered a particular kind of isolation, on top of the physical hardship, a homesickness sharpened into something nearer to despair. Soviet soldiers defending their own home soil carried a different weight. Instead, the specific terror of Order number 227 sitting behind them, and the simple, exhausting knowledge that there was nowhere else in the entire country left to retreat to, even if they had wanted to. It is worth noting too that these two kinds of psychological weight were not really equivalent even if both were real. A homesick soldier can in theory still hope for a letter, a transfer, an eventual ticket home to a country that still exists safely behind him. A soldier defending the literal ground his own family might be standing on somewhere just beyond the front line does not get to separate the war from home in quite the same way. Fear, it turns out, is not a single uniform substance. It takes on the specific shape of whatever you actually stand to lose. Can I ask you something? When you picture the word battlefield, what actually comes to mind first? Explosions, probably. Charging soldiers, maybe. I think it is worth asking yourself, honestly, how often disease, hunger, and lice make it into that mental picture at all? They rarely do in most retellings, and yet for the overwhelming majority of soldiers on both sides of this particular fight, those unglamorous, undramatic miseries were a far larger part of daily experience than any single dramatic firefight ever was. I do not think that makes the more dramatic stories we have already told in this video any less true or any less worth telling. Pavlov's men really did hold that building. Zaitsev really was a formidable and disciplined marksman, whatever exaggerations eventually attached themselves to his legend. But I think a story like this one deserves the quieter, less cinematic parts too. The lice, the hunger, the disease, the children scavenging through rubble, because leaving those details out would give you a false picture of what actually happened here, one that is somehow both more comfortable and considerably less honest. And here is the deeply unsettling part of the detail that I think deserves to sit with you for a moment before we move forward. Everything we have just described, the hunger, the disease, the cold beginning to creep in at the edges of each night, all of it was still happening under conditions that, compared to what was coming, actually counted as relatively survivable. Both armies were still being supplied, even if imperfectly. Both armies still had some route back to their own lines. Men could still, in theory, be pulled out, wounded, resupplied, rotated, replaced. What none of them yet knew on either side of that exhausted, disease-ridden front was that the true catastrophe of this battle had not even begun yet. It was being planned at that very moment hundreds of miles away in a war room where nobody was thinking about lice or hunger or frightened children scavenging through the ruins at all. Maps were being drawn. Arrows were being sketched across weak points in the German line that nobody trapped inside the city had any way of seeing coming. And within a matter of weeks, everything we have just described as difficult, the hunger, the cold, the disease, would look, by comparison, almost survivable. Those weak points I just mentioned were not some abstract military concept sitting in a textbook somewhere. They had an actual physical location hundreds of miles of open, exposed steppe on either side of the city, and if you had stood on that ground yourself in the autumn of 1942, you might have noticed something troubling almost immediately, even without any special military training at all. You would have felt it, I think, in the sheer emptiness of the horizon, mile after mile of flat undefended ground, with nothing much standing between a determined enemy and the rear of an entire army. Here is the problem German planners had created for themselves, whether they fully admitted it to themselves or not. Every soldier committed to the grinding fight inside Stalingrad was a soldier who could not also be standing guard somewhere else. Picture the geography for a moment, because it helps explain just how impossible this task actually was. The front line curving around the city and its approaches stretched for hundreds of miles, following the bend of the Don River to the north and sweeping across open, largely empty steppe to the south. Defending a line that long properly would have required a scale of manpower, Germany simply no longer had available, not after more than a year of grinding warfare across the entire Eastern Front. So German command did what coalition armies throughout history have often done in a similar bind. It leaned on its allies. Along the northern flank above the city stood the Romanian Third Army, roughly 170,000 men holding a stretch of the Don River bend nearly 90 miles long. To the south, covering an even longer stretch of open, largely featureless steppe, stood the Romanian Fourth Army, considerably smaller, somewhere around 75,000 men, trying to cover well over 150 miles of front. Further west along the same general line sat an Italian army, and beyond that a Hungarian one. On paper this looked like a broad multinational coalition, standing shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. In practice it looked more like a chain, assembled out of several completely different metals, one section forged from good steel, and several others cobbled together from whatever happened to be lying around. There is a small, almost darkly funny detail buried inside this arrangement, one that says a great deal about how fragile this particular alliance actually was underneath the surface. German commanders deliberately positioned the Italian army between the Hungarian and Romanian sectors, not for any tactical reason related to the Soviets at all, but because Hungary and Romania had a long, bitter, unresolved territorial dispute over a region called Transylvania, and German planners truly worried that if you placed Hungarian and Romanian units directly next to each other, along the same front line, old grudges might flare up before the actual enemy even arrived. Think about that for a second. An alliance so brittle, that its own architects had to build in a buffer zone just to keep two of its own members from potentially turning on each other. Have you ever been part of a group project where half the team barely trusted the other half, and everyone quietly hoped nobody would ever have to actually rely on the weakest link under real pressure? That, roughly speaking, was the structural reality German command had built for itself along hundreds of miles of the most important defensive line in the entire campaign, and these were not simply differences of national pride or army politics. The equipment gap was real, and it was severe. Romanian, Italian and Hungarian units defending these flanks were for the most part using anti-tank weapons that had already been outdated years earlier, guns that physically could not punch through the armour of a modern Soviet tank at any range that actually mattered in combat. Many units still depended on horses to move their artillery and supplies, a detail that sounds almost quaint until you remember exactly what kind of mechanized armoured assault they were eventually going to be asked to withstand. Winter clothing arrived late, and never in sufficient quantity. Soldiers along the Romanian Fourth Army's stretch of front were by multiple accounts living in little more than holes scraped into the frozen ground, covered with stretched canvas as temperatures kept dropping toward -20 degrees. It is worth pausing on that image for a second. Men sleeping in dirt holes covered with fabric expected to somehow stand firm against a modern mechanized army, equipped with tanks that their own weapons could barely scratch, let alone stop. This was not a fair fight, and on some level everyone involved seemed to understand that right up to the moment it actually mattered. Would you feel confident holding a defensive line with weapons you already knew could not stop the enemy's tanks? I am not sure I would, and yet that is exactly the position hundreds of thousands of these soldiers found themselves standing in that autumn. The Hungarian Second Army, holding a stretch of the line further to the northwest, faced a nearly identical set of problems: chronic equipment shortages, an impossibly long front to defend and command structures that rarely trusted them with enough independence to react quickly to their own instincts. Their turn in this particular story was still to come, and when it arrived, a matter of weeks later, the consequences would prove every bit as devastating as what was about to happen to the Romanians. I want to be careful here because it would be easy and frankly a little unfair to tell this part of the story in a way that makes these soldiers sound like the weak link in some simple, convenient morality tale. They were not cowards. Multiple German officers who served alongside them later wrote with real respect about Romanian units, fighting with genuine bravery under conditions that would have broken far better equipped armies. A German general specifically assigned to assess the Romanian Third Army's performance after the fact reached a conclusion strikingly different from the one that would later dominate popular memory. His report described troops fighting bravely with real heroism, overwhelmed not by any lack of courage, but simply by an enemy fielding far more tanks than anyone had prepared them to face tanks. Their own weapons were never capable of stopping in the first place. Courage, it turns out, was never really the problem here. Equipment was. After the war, this part of the story took an unfair turn in how it was remembered. Several German commanders writing their own memoirs years later quietly shifted a disproportionate share of the blame onto their Romanian, Italian and Hungarian allies, painting them as the weak link that failed at the critical moment. It is a convenient story, and it is also, according to most careful modern historians, more than a little dishonest. The soldiers holding those flanks did not choose to be under-equipped. They did not choose to be spread across nearly 300 miles of open ground with a fraction of the firepower they actually needed. Those decisions were made considerably higher up the chain of command by the same men who conveniently were the ones writing the memoirs afterward. Even German generals themselves, writing honestly after the war, admitted as much. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most respected military minds, later observed that no army group headquarters could realistically manage more than about 5 armies at once, and that the difficulty multiplied considerably once most of those armies belonged to different nations, spoke different languages, and followed different training standards entirely. Army Group B, the force responsible for both Stalingrad and these exposed flanks, was juggling considerably more than that. That is not a criticism written by some Soviet propagandist trying to score a point after the fact. That is one of Germany's own most respected generals admitting in his own memoirs that the command structure protecting Stalingrad's flanks was by design set up to fail. Here is where this story stops being merely sad and starts becoming deeply maddening, at least to me, and I suspect it will to you too once you hear it. This vulnerability was not some hidden secret that only became obvious in hindsight decades later, safely removed from the pressure of the moment. People saw this coming. Real officers with real information tried repeatedly to warn their superiors and were repeatedly brushed aside. As early as August, the commander of the Romanian Third Army noticed Soviet forces establishing small footholds across the Don River, exactly the kind of staging points an army might use to launch a much larger offensive later on. He requested German assistance to clear them out while there was still time. The request went nowhere. German command, fixated entirely on the fight for the city itself, showed little interest in a problem sitting more than 100 miles away from the action everyone back in Berlin actually cared about. By early November, a German liaison officer attached to that same Romanian army was reporting clear signs of a major Soviet build-up directly opposite their position tanks, artillery, fresh divisions, all of it. Romania's own defense minister personally pressed the German ambassador for more supplies and reinforcements, around this same time warning, almost pleading, that large-scale Soviet action appeared to be forming in exactly the sector his troops were holding. He reportedly told the ambassador in language that leaves very little room for misinterpretation that his army was all his country actually had, and that losing it was simply not an option he was willing to accept quietly. It is the kind of plea that in hindsight reads less like a routine diplomatic request, and more like a man watching a slow-moving disaster and trying one last time to get someone with real authority to actually look up from the map of the city long enough to notice it. And then there is my personal favourite detail in this entire chapter of the story, one that I think captures the whole tragedy in a single, almost unbearably ironic moment. A junior German officer, a captain by the name of Winrich Baer, arrived to take up a new post that October and was shown a situation map by the officer he was replacing. That outgoing officer traced with apparently calm confidence the exact route he expected a future Soviet offensive to take, sweeping around both flanks before tapping his finger on a small town called Kalach and saying more or less that this was roughly where the two arms of the attack would eventually meet. Baer himself later recalled feeling a real chill hearing that prediction laid out so calmly, the way you might feel listening to a weather forecaster describe a storm that everyone else in the room seemed determined to ignore. If a single company grade officer sitting with nothing more than a map and some common sense could sketch out that scenario with something bordering on eerie accuracy weeks in advance, you have to ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable question. How did the people with far more information, far more authority, and far more responsibility manage to miss it? Or worse, simply choose not to act on it? I think the honest answer says less about intelligence failures and more about a very human, very familiar kind of stubbornness. Berlin had already decided emotionally as much as strategically that Stalingrad was the story that mattered. Every resource, every reserve division, every ounce of attention kept flowing toward that one symbolic prize. We talked about earlier in this video the city carrying a rival's name. Germany's own high command did in fact recognize this exact structural problem that same autumn and even proposed a fix, splitting off a new, more manageable command specifically to oversee the Allied armies guarding these flanks. Hitler agreed to the idea in principle, but insisted the reorganization wait until after Stalingrad had actually been captured, which meant in practice that a known solution to a known problem sat waiting on a shelf somewhere in Berlin, delayed by the same stubborn insistence on finishing the symbolic fight first, right up until the moment it was too late for the fix to matter at all. Even General Paulus himself, commanding the very army whose survival depended entirely on those flanks holding, put the stakes into words with startling clarity in the middle of November, saying plainly that the fate of his entire Sixth Army would come down to how well the Romanian defence of those flanks actually held up. He understood exactly what was at risk. Understanding it and actually fixing it, it turns out, were two very different things. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. Have you ever seen a problem coming from a long way off, tried to raise the alarm and simply been ignored by people with more authority than you, more confident than you, and completely wrong? If so, you already understand exactly how those Romanian commanders and that one clear-eyed German captain must have felt as October rolled into November, watching the same warning signs pile up again and again, while nothing meaningful changed in response. Soviet reconnaissance patrols, meanwhile, had spent weeks quietly mapping exactly where these weaknesses sat, probing gently at the edges of the Romanian lines, taking prisoners for interrogation, building a detailed picture of precisely how thin this particular chain had actually become. They were not guessing, they already knew. By the middle of November, everything that needed to be in place for a catastrophe was already sitting quietly on the map waiting. An exhausted German army fully committed to a city it could not yet fully capture. A patchwork of Allied armies holding hundreds of miles of front with equipment that belonged to an earlier era of warfare entirely. Warnings that had already been raised and already been dismissed more than once. If there is a single lesson worth carrying forward out of this particular chapter, I think it is this. Confidence and preparation are not the same thing, and it is entirely possible for an army or a person or an organization of almost any kind to feel completely certain of victory while standing on ground that has already quietly begun to give way beneath them. The most dangerous moment in any long struggle is rarely the one everyone is bracing for. It is usually the one everyone stopped watching carefully enough, because their attention had already been captured by something louder nearer and considerably more glamorous. All that remained now in the most unsettling sense imaginable was a date on a calendar, and the moment somebody on the other side of that quiet snow-dusted steppe finally decided it was time to move. The date on that calendar turned out to be the 19th of November 1942, and the moment itself arrived not with a single gunshot, but with something nearer to the sky itself tearing open. At 7:20 in the morning, Moscow time, in fog thick enough to hide the horizon, more than 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and heavy mortars opened fire on the Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, all at once, in a bombardment that lasted roughly an hour and 20 minutes without any real pause. Soldiers who lived through it later struggled to describe the sound in ordinary language less like individual explosions, and more like one continuous endless roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers' weapons, whose distinctive shriek had already earned them a nickname among terrified German troops, added their own particular brand of noise to the chaos. For the Romanian soldiers we spent so much time talking about a moment ago, the ones sleeping in dirt holes covered with canvas, holding weapons that could not stop a modern tank, That hour and 20 minutes must have felt considerably longer than the clock actually recorded. This operation had a name, by the way, one that still gets mentioned in military academies today as something bordering on a textbook execution of exactly what it set out to do. The Soviets called it Operation Uranus, and the man most responsible for designing it, General Georgy Zhukov, had pulled off something remarkably similar once before years earlier, against a different enemy entirely. Back in 1939, fighting the Japanese army along a remote stretch of the Mongolian border, Zhukov had used a double pincer movement to completely surround and destroy an entire enemy division there too. A lesser-known battle most people outside military history circles have never heard of, despite how directly it shaped what was about to happen here. Stalingrad was not really his first attempt at this particular kind of trap. It was his second, refined, scaled up considerably, and aimed now at an army that badly underestimated exactly who it was dealing with. There is a term for this specific kind of maneuver, by the way, and I think you will appreciate the irony buried inside it once you hear it. Military planners call it a cauldron battle, a Kesselschlacht, and it happens to be a distinctly German military concept, one the Wehrmacht itself had used with devastating success throughout the opening months of this very war, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies in the summer of 1941. Which means that on this particular November morning, the Red Army was not inventing something new, so much as it was handing Germany's own signature weapon directly back to them, aimed now in the opposite direction. If you have ever lost a game specifically because your opponent studied your own strategy and simply executed it better than you did, you already understand exactly how uncomfortable that particular kind of defeat feels. Have you ever had somebody use your own advice or your own strategy against you so effectively that you almost had to respect it even while it was actively working against your own interests? That is roughly the position German commanders found themselves standing in that November morning. Historians who study the mechanics of encirclement warfare sometimes trace this exact tactical pattern back more than 2,000 years to a battle fought in southern Italy in the year 216 before the Common Era, when a Carthaginian general named Hannibal used almost exactly this same double envelopment to annihilate a much larger Roman army in a single afternoon. Zhukov almost certainly studied that ancient battle as a young officer, the way military students still do today. It is a strange thought that a maneuver first perfected in the ancient world, fought with spears and shields on a dusty Italian plain, could still prove devastatingly effective more than 2,000 years later, fought instead with tanks and rocket artillery on a frozen Russian steppe. The scale of the force Zhukov actually committed to this particular operation deserved a moment of its own too. Somewhere in the neighbourhood of 1 million Soviet soldiers took part, supported by roughly 900 tanks, and well over 1,000 aircraft, an assembly of manpower and machinery that German intelligence, fixated as it was on the fight for the city itself, had almost completely failed to notice, gathering just beyond their own field of vision. Once the bombardment finally lifted, Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward across ground. The Romanian Third Army had no real way of holding. And here is where I want to slow down for a second, because I think it matters, given everything we just spent an entire chapter establishing about these soldiers. They did not simply collapse and run. Multiple Romanian units fought hard in those opening hours, inflicting real casualties, holding certain positions well past what anyone could reasonably have expected from troops that under-equipped. By late morning on the first day, Soviet forces had advanced only a handful of miles, in some sectors considerably less than planners back at headquarters had actually hoped for. But holding a defensive line intact and stopping a breakthrough entirely are two very different achievements, and by the end of that first day, Soviet tank columns had already found gaps wide enough to pour straight through. bypassing pockets of continued Romanian resistance entirely, rather than wasting time trying to crush them directly. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it is a detail modern military strategists still study carefully. You do not always need to defeat every single soldier standing in your way. Sometimes you simply need to find the handful of places where the line is thinnest, push through those specific gaps, and let speed itself do the rest of the work before the enemy can even react. And react is exactly what German command struggled to do. Paulus and his staff, still deeply consumed by the ongoing fight inside the city itself, were slow to fully grasp the scale of what was actually unfolding out on the open steppe behind them. The mobile reserves Germany actually had available to respond a battered panzer corps that by this point in the campaign had roughly the fighting strength of a single division, rather than the several divisions it should have contained, proved nowhere near powerful enough to seal the gap in time. Some of the tanks that did move to intercept the advancing Soviet spearheads were low enough on fuel that commanders had to make agonizing choices about which units got to move at all. Soviet mechanized spearheads, tanks and motorized infantry moving fast and largely unopposed kept driving southwest, exactly along the route that one particular German captain had already sketched out on a map weeks earlier for anyone willing to actually look at it. Remember Captain Bear, the officer from our last chapter who watched his predecessor trace this exact scenario out on a situation map back in October? I have to imagine there was a very particular, very cold kind of validation in watching a prediction like that come true in real time, the sort of feeling that offers no satisfaction at all, only a sick confirmation that you'd been right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about instead. There is no surviving record of Bear celebrating that particular moment of vindication, and I doubt he would have wanted to. Being right about a catastrophe you have no power to prevent is one of the loneliest positions a person can occupy, watching events confirm your worst fears in real time, while everyone around you scrambles to catch up to a reality you already understood weeks earlier. For the Romanian soldiers who survived those first chaotic hours, retreat quickly became its own kind of nightmare columns of exhausted men trying to outrun tanks across open snow-covered ground, with nowhere to hide and nothing resembling a coordinated escape plan. Many were captured. A great many more simply never made it out of that particular stretch of steppe at all. The bravery we talked about in the previous chapter did not disappear on this day. It simply was not enough on its own to survive an attack this large, this fast, and this thoroughly planned. A second Soviet assault struck the following day on the 20th of November, this time against the Romanian Fourth Army holding the open steppe south of the city, and it met almost exactly the same fate. The southern pincer began racing northwest, mirroring the northern won both arms of this enormous mechanized claw, now converging toward a single modest little town on the Don River that almost nobody outside the region had ever heard of before that particular week. Kalash. By the 22nd of November, advance units from both Soviet pincers had reached the area around that town, and on the following day the 23rd forward elements of the two forces actually met each other in person, near a smaller settlement nearby, sealing the ring completely. Picture that moment for a second because I think it deserves a little more attention than a simple date usually gets in most retellings. Soviet soldiers who had spent days fighting their way across open freezing steppe from two completely different directions, coming from the north and from the south, converging on the exact same patch of ground near enough now to physically shake each other's hands. Some accounts describe soldiers embracing laughing, almost giddy with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Photographs taken that day show men from both pincers standing together, arms around each other's shoulders, some of them grinning in a way that looks almost startlingly young for soldiers who had just spent days fighting across open freezing ground. It is one of the more human images to survive this entire campaign, Ordinary young men thousands of miles from anywhere resembling homes celebrating together in the snow because they had just finished building together one of the largest traps in the history of modern warfare. They had done it. The trap months in the planning had actually shut. For the ordinary German soldier still fighting inside Stalingrad itself, most of them still focused entirely on the building-to-building struggle. We spent so much time describing earlier. News of the encirclement arrived almost as a rumour at first, passed soldier to soldier, in disbelieving whispers before officers confirmed it through official channels. Imagine fighting for weeks over a single stairwell, utterly consumed by the next few feet of rubble in front of you, only to learn that the entire war around you had just changed shape completely, and that the ground beneath your own feet was now quite literally surrounded on every side. And what exactly had they sealed inside it? Somewhere between 290,000 and 330,000 Axis soldiers, a mixture of Germans, Romanians, Italians and Croatians, along with their equipment, their vehicles, and crucially an amount of food and fuel that was already nowhere near sufficient for an army that size sitting still in one place for very long. To put that number in perspective for a second, that is roughly the entire population of a mid-sized American city, all of it suddenly trapped inside a pocket of ruined buildings, and open frozen steppe with exactly one way in or out remaining available to it: the air. Try to hold that image steady in your mind for a moment, because I think it is easy to let a number that large simply blur past without really landing. Somewhere near 1/3 men stripped almost overnight of any real route home, any real certainty of survival, standing now inside a ring that Soviet artillery could reach from almost any direction at will. Whatever any individual soldier trapped inside that pocket had personally done or believed or hoped for when this campaign first began back in the warmth of summer, none of that mattered anymore. Geography alone had just decided their immediate future for them. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you were commanding an army that size suddenly and completely surrounded with winter, tightening its grip and supply lines already stretched to breaking, what would your first instinct actually be? Break out immediately, while your forces still had enough fuel and momentum to fight their way west toward friendly lines, or dig and trust that help was coming and wait? I suspect most military professionals then and now would tell you the first option gave you a considerably better chance of survival. As we're about to find out, that decision was not actually going to be Paulus's to make. There is something worth reflecting on here beyond just the mechanics of tanks and pincers and dates on a map. For more than a year, it has been the German army doing this to other people, sweeping around confused, poorly coordinated Soviet forces and sealing enormous, devastating pockets around them in Belarus and Ukraine, all across the opening months of this war. Stalingrad marks the moment that pattern reversed itself completely, the hunter finding itself almost overnight, transformed into something else entirely. History rarely offers a turn this clean, this symmetrical, or honestly this satisfying to look back on, depending of course on which side of that ring you happen to be standing. I do not think it is an accident, by the way, that this particular battle gets taught in military academies around the world today, not just for its scale, which was truly enormous, but for how cleanly it demonstrates a lesson that seems to need relearning in every single generation. Overwhelming strength concentrated in one visible, glamorous location means very little if the quiet, unglamorous ground protecting it is left thin enough to break. We spent an entire earlier chapter of this story establishing exactly why those flanks were vulnerable. This is the chapter where that vulnerability stopped being a warning on somebody's situation map and became an inescapable, unavoidable reality for hundreds of thousands of actual human beings. Word of the encirclement reached German high command within hours and reached Hitler himself not long after that. What happened next, the decision made in response to this sudden staggering crisis, would end up shaping the fate of every single soldier now trapped inside that pocket, and it is frankly one of the more consequential and coldly stubborn decisions of the entire war. But that decision, and everything that grew out of it, deserves its own space to unfold properly, because what Hitler chose to do next did not just fail to fix this catastrophe. In more than one meaningful sense, it made it very considerably worse. Hitler's answer, when it finally came, was breathtakingly simple and breathtakingly dangerous in almost equal measure. No breakout. Hold the position. Help was coming from the sky. Picture receiving news like that if you were one of the exhausted soldiers inside that pocket staring out across miles of frozen hostile steppe in every direction, and being told essentially to simply wait, trust and hold on. It is one thing to ask that of a person for a day or even a week. It is another thing entirely to ask it of 250,000 men, with a Russian winter tightening its grip around them, and nowhere left to run even if the order had been different. To understand why anyone believed that promise was even remotely realistic, you have to go back a little further to an earlier, much smaller crisis that had on the surface ended in success. Earlier that same year, a much smaller German force, somewhere around 100,000 men, had been surrounded near a town called Demyansk, far to the north, and the Luftwaffe had actually managed to keep that pocket supplied from the air for months, until relief eventually broke through and rescued them. That earlier operation had required roughly 300 tons of supplies delivered daily, and Germany had committed nearly 500 transport aircraft to the task, an enormous but crucially achievable number given the smaller scale involved. When word reached Hitler that his Sixth Army was now trapped inside Stalingrad, that earlier success was apparently the first thing several of his advisors reached for a comforting recent precedent that seemed to prove the whole idea could work. There was just one problem, and it is the kind of problem that tends to surface whenever someone reaches for the nearest convenient comparison, instead of actually running the numbers properly. The army trapped at Stalingrad was well over double the size of the one rescued at Demyansk. The Demyansk airlift happened in spring, not the brutal heart of a Russian winter, and Soviet air power in early 1942, when Demyansk unfolded, was a shadow of what it had grown into by the final weeks of that same year. Comparing the two situations was a little like successfully carrying one heavy suitcase up a single flight of stairs, and concluding from that experience that you could easily carry 3 suitcases up an entire mountain in a blizzard. The math simply did not transfer the way anyone wanted it to. Here is a question worth turning over for a second. Have you ever watched someone make a big decision by reaching for the one example that happened to support what they already wanted to believe while quietly ignoring 3 or 4 other examples that would have told a very different story? That is essentially what happened here at the highest level of German military command, with hundreds of thousands of lives resting on the outcome. The man tasked with actually making this airlift work was Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, and it is worth understanding a little about where he personally stood at this particular moment, because I think it explains a great deal about what happened next. Göring had fallen considerably out of favour with Hitler 2 years earlier after his air force failed to defeat Britain during the Battle of Britain. By the winter of 1942, he was by most accounts eager for any opportunity to restore his own reputation. When Hitler asked whether the Luftwaffe could keep an entire encircled army supplied through the depths of a Russian winter, Göring did not hesitate. He said yes confidently, personally, without qualification. It is worth sitting with the irony of that moment for a second. The last time Göring had made a grand confident promise about exactly what his air force could accomplish, boasting that the Luftwaffe alone could finish off trapped Allied forces at Dunkirk back in 1940, rather than risking German tanks to do it, he had also been catastrophically wrong, a miscalculation that let an entire British army escape across the Channel largely intact. History, it seems, does not always teach the lessons we might hope it would, especially to men more interested in protecting their own reputation than in honestly assessing what their forces could actually deliver. His own senior commanders in the field were considerably less confident than their commander back in Berlin. Officers actually stationed near the front men who understood better than anyone exactly how few aircraft were available and exactly how brutal winter flying conditions in this particular region could get privately warned that sustaining an airlift at anything near the required scale through an entire Russian winter was in blunt terms next to impossible. Sound familiar? You may be noticing a pattern here, and if so, you are noticing something real. This is the second time in this story that we've watched capable, well-informed officers try to warn their superiors about an approaching disaster only to be ignored, dismissed, or simply outranked. When a pattern repeats itself this clearly, at some point it stops looking like bad luck and starts looking a great deal more like a fundamental flaw in how this entire war machine actually made decisions. The Sixth Army calculated it needed somewhere around 750 tons of supplies delivered every single day just to keep functioning food, fuel and ammunition for 250,000 men and their remaining vehicles. On its best days, the actual airlift delivered barely a tenth of that figure. Weather-grounded flights, constantly thick fog and blinding snow shutting entire airfields down for days at a stretch. Available aircraft were in many cases poorly suited to sustained winter operations, their engines struggling to even start in temperatures that dropped low enough to crack metal, and Soviet fighters increasingly picked off the slow, heavily loaded transport planes as they lumbered toward the pocket. Each lost aircraft was not simply a statistic either. It was several tons of food or ammunition that would now never reach the men waiting for it, and a flight crew who almost certainly would not be coming home. The promise made from Berlin and the reality unfolding on frozen airstrips hundreds of miles away were from the very first week two almost entirely unrelated things. While that promise quietly failed to hold up in the sky, a different kind of hope was being organized on the ground. Hitler assigned Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered one of the sharpest military minds Germany had to command, a new relief effort aimed at physically punching a corridor through to the trapped army. It is worth pausing for a moment on Manstein himself here, because history sometimes forgets that the men making these enormous strategic decisions were also quietly grieving human beings. In the weeks just before taking up this assignment, Manstein had buried a trusted aide killed in a plane crash, and then learned that his own son had been killed in action, on a completely different stretch of the front. He carried both of those losses with him into what became one of the most desperate rescue missions of the entire war. His plan, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, launched on the 12th of December, and for the first several days it actually went remarkably well. The attack launched from a staging area near a town called Kotelnikovo, roughly 75 miles southwest of the pocket, spearheaded by panzer divisions that included some of Germany's most experienced armoured units. On the very first day alone, some of these columns covered nearly 40 miles of open ground, a pace that briefly made the entire desperate gamble look like it might actually succeed. Hope, cautious at first and then increasingly urgent, began spreading through the trapped Sixth Army almost like a fever. An intelligence officer serving inside the pocket later described the mood in those days with real aching honesty, recalling how desperately every man in that encircled army craved good news, how the simple phrase "Manstein is coming" became something bordering on a prayer repeated soldier to soldier, unit to unit, as the promised relief force fought its way nearer. By the 19th of December, Manstein's spearhead had advanced to within roughly 30 miles of the trapped Sixth Army, near enough that on a clear day forward, observers could reportedly see flares from the relief force lighting up the horizon. 30 miles. After everything, this story has already covered the failed summer campaign, the bombing, the building-by-building slaughter. The encirclement itself, the war had come down to 30 miles of open, snow-covered ground separating 250,000 trapped men from something resembling rescue. Soldiers inside the pocket later described watching the horizon each evening, searching for any sign of flash of artillery, a flare, anything that might confirm the relief force was still fighting its way toward them. Hope, it turns out, does not need much fuel to keep burning. 30 miles of open ground and a rumour passed from man to man was apparently enough, and this is the part of the story that I find almost unbearable to sit with, honestly, because it did not have to end the way it did. Manstein believed and argued forcefully that the only real chance of saving the Sixth Army was for Paulus to abandon the city entirely, break out from the inside, and fight his way west to meet the approaching relief force partway. Paulus, by every account, wanted to attempt exactly that, but Hitler forbade it flatly and repeatedly, insisting the army hold Stalingrad itself no matter what. When Manstein pressed the issue directly in one final desperate phone call, Hitler's response was reportedly dismissive, almost to the point of cruelty, pointing out that Paulus claimed he barely had enough fuel left to travel 15 or 20 miles in the first place, as though that shortage was simply an unfortunate detail rather than the direct, entirely foreseeable consequence of weeks spent trapped without proper resupply. Think about the sheer, circular cruelty embedded inside that response for a moment. The army was too weak to break out because it had been denied adequate supplies, and the reason given for continuing to deny it the freedom to try was that same weakness, the very weakness Berlin's own broken promises had helped create in the first place. Can I ask you something? Have you ever watched two people who both wanted to do the right thing get stopped, not by each other, but by a third person who refused to budge and simply had more authority than either of them? That, in essence, is what happened on that stretch of frozen steppe in December. The rescuer and the man waiting to be rescued both understood what needed to happen. Neither one of them was allowed to make it happen. Then the last real chance slipped away entirely, and it slipped away from a direction almost nobody trapped inside Stalingrad was even watching. On the 16th of December, the Red Army launched an entirely separate offensive, this one aimed squarely at the Italian Eighth Army holding a stretch of front well to the northwest of Manstein's advancing relief columns. That Italian line collapsed with frightening speed, opening a gap so dangerous that it threatened to swallow not just the relief operation, but potentially Manstein's entire army group along with it. He was left with an impossible choice: keep pushing towards Stalingrad and risk losing everything, or pull back the very forces trying to complete the rescue in order to save them from a second encirclement of their own. As if that were not enough, 8 days later, on Christmas Eve itself, Soviet tanks struck a rear air base the Luftwaffe had been using to help supply the pocket, destroying or damaging dozens of aircraft sitting exposed on the ground, and forcing German forces to relocate their remaining supply operation to airfields considerably further away. Every single mile added to that distance meant fewer flights, smaller loads, and an already inadequate airlift growing thinner still on the one day of the calendar year most associated across an enormous swathe of the world with hope, family, and homecoming. By the 23rd of December, Manstein had no realistic choice left. He called off Operation Winter Storm. The next day, Christmas Eve, his exhausted panzer divisions began withdrawing back toward their starting positions, moving away from the very army they had come so near to saving. Inside the pocket, the phrase that had carried so many exhausted men through the previous 2 weeks, "Manstein is coming," quietly stopped being spoken at all. Albert Speer, one of the most senior officials inside the Nazi government at the time, later wrote that this particular defeat felt different from every setback that had come before it. Until this moment, he recalled, there had always been some fresh success elsewhere to offset a loss, some new triumph to help everyone forget what had just gone wrong. Stalingrad for the first time offered no such comfort. There was simply nothing left to point to instead. Have you ever had a moment in your own life where you could suddenly feel almost physically that something you had been hoping for was not actually going to happen? Even before anyone said so directly, I imagine that is something like what settled over that pocket in the final days of December. There is a particular kind of despair that settles in only after hope has been allowed to rise, and then taken away again, different and in some ways heavier than despair, that never had hope attached to it at all. The men inside that pocket had believed for a little more than a week in December that rescue was not just possible, but actively underway, visible, audible, real. Watching that possibility retreat back over the horizon left behind something considerably harder to carry than simple fear ever could. What remained now inside that shrinking, starving pocket was not really a battle in any traditional sense anymore. It was something nearer to a slow, grinding countdown, and the men living through it were about to discover just how much worse conditions could still get even after everything they had already survived. January arrived inside that pocket like a door quietly shutting, and what had already been difficult in December slid week by week into something considerably harder to describe in ordinary language at all. Try to imagine the sound of that door if a door this large and this cold can even be said to make a sound at all. Less a slam, more a slow, grinding shift, the kind that happens gradually enough that the men trapped on the wrong side of it do not fully register the moment it finally completely shut behind them. Soldiers' letters home from this stretch of the siege, the ones that actually survived long enough to be studied decades later, sound less like military correspondence and more like a slow, honest accounting of everything a human body needs simply to keep functioning, and how little of it remained. One non-commissioned officer wrote plainly that his unit had been reduced to sharing a single loaf of bread among 7 grown men. Another described chopping meat from the frozen carcass of a horse with an axe, grateful for it in a way that under any normal circumstance would sound almost absurd. Another soldier, writing to his parents in these same weeks, described entire companies that had once numbered well over 100 men now reduced to barely 30, and confessed that he was no longer sure he would survive long enough to finish explaining what had happened to the rest. Along the roads leading toward what remained of the pocket's shrinking supply routes, men who had simply frozen to death where they stood or sat became an unremarkable everyday feature of the landscape, stepped around rather than mourned, because there was no longer enough time, strength or feeling left over for anything else. On the 8th of January, something unexpected happened. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Soviet forces tightening the ring around the city, offered Paulus a surprisingly generous set of surrender terms: full rations, medical treatment for the wounded, permission to keep uniforms and personal belongings, and eventual repatriation once the war ended. Rokossovsky did not dress the offer up in any diplomatic language either. He told Paulus plainly that his position had become impossible. It is worth pausing on the sheer human decency embedded inside that offer for a moment, especially given everything this particular war had already shown both sides capable of by this point. Rokossovsky was not obligated to extend anything resembling generous terms to a starving, defeated enemy. He did so anyway, whether out of practical calculation, real mercy, or some combination of both, and it stands as one of the more quietly humane gestures in this entire 5-month-long story. Paulus forwarded the offer to Berlin and asked for permission to accept it. Hitler said no. His reasoning, chillingly practical once you actually sit with it, was that every additional day the Sixth Army continued fighting, even while starving, even while freezing, even while accomplishing nothing resembling an actual military objective anymore, still tied down enormous numbers of Soviet soldiers and equipment that might otherwise be redirected elsewhere along the front. In other words, the men trapped inside that pocket were no longer being asked to win anything. They were simply being asked to keep dying slowly enough for long enough to buy time for other German forces hundreds of miles away. If you have ever felt like you were being kept in an impossible situation, not because anyone actually believed you could still succeed, but purely because your continued suffering happened to be useful to somebody else, I imagine that particular flavour of despair might sound uncomfortably familiar. 2 weeks later, on the 22nd of January, Hitler sent another telegram rejecting a second request, just as firmly insisting the army fight in his own chosen words to the last soldier and the last bullet. By this point, something like 18,000 wounded men inside the pocket had no meaningful access to medical care at all, packed into cellars and ruined buildings that had never been proper hospitals to begin with, waiting for treatment that both sides understood by now was never actually going to arrive. Doctors who had already been working past the point of exhaustion for months found themselves making decisions no medical training really prepares a person for deciding essentially which of the wounded still had enough of a chance at survival to justify the last remaining supplies of anaesthetic and bandages and which did not. By the 25th, the last usable airstrip inside the pocket, the one thin, fragile lifeline still connecting these men to anything resembling outside support fell to advancing Soviet troops. Whatever remained of that failed airlift we spent so much time discussing earlier effectively ended that day not with any formal announcement, but simply because there was no longer anywhere left for a plane to land. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. At what point does courage stop being a virtue and start becoming something nearer to a tool used by people far away who are risking absolutely nothing themselves? I am not sure there is a clean answer to that question. I am fairly confident, though, that the men actually living through those final January days in Stalingrad had stopped asking it academically and started feeling it directly in their own bodies. Then, on the 30th of January, 10 years to the day after Hitler had first come to power in Germany, a strange and specific kind of message arrived by radio inside the pocket. It is worth sitting with how deliberately chosen that timing actually was. Hitler did not send it on some random Tuesday. He sent it on the 10th anniversary of the exact day he had first taken power, a date already loaded with propaganda significance, apparently hoping to fold what he expected to happen next into the same commemorative occasion, one final symbolic gift to the regime's own origin story. Hitler issued a wave of battlefield promotions to Paulus's officers, apparently intended to boost morale in these final hours, and at the very top of that list he promoted Paulus himself to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest military rank in the entire German armed forces. On paper, it looked like an honour. It was not really meant as one. Here is the piece of German military tradition you need to understand for this moment to actually land the way it should. In the entire history of the Prussian and German officer corps going back generations, no field marshal had ever been captured alive by an enemy. The rank itself carried an unspoken, almost sacred expectation attached to it, that a man who reached that level of command would rather die by his own hand if necessary, than allow himself to be taken prisoner and paraded as a symbol of defeat. Hitler did not need to spell any of this out explicitly in the promotion order. Everyone receiving it understood exactly what it was actually asking Paulus to do. Paulus, by most accounts, was a devout Catholic, and taking his own life sat directly against everything his faith had taught him his entire adult life. According to more than one officer who spoke with him during those final hours, he responded to the promotion with something bordering on open contempt, reportedly dismissing the idea that he owed Hitler the favour of dying on command. Historians still debate the exact wording of what he actually said in that moment, and I think honestly the precise phrasing matters less than the plain fact underneath it. A man who had just been elevated to the highest rank in his country's military looked at the unspoken instruction attached to that rank and quietly decided he was not going to follow it. Would you have made the same choice, do you think, if you had spent your entire adult life inside a military culture that treated surrender as the ultimate personal failure? Or is there a point where simple survival becomes its own kind of quiet courage, regardless of what tradition says it is supposed to look like? Before the very last aircraft left the pocket that same week, Paulus did one more small, deeply human thing worth mentioning here, something that rarely makes it into the more strategic retellings of this battle. He sent his wedding ring home to his wife. I think about that detail more than almost anything else in this particular chapter, honestly. In the middle of a collapsing army surrounded by frozen dead and starving survivors, in the final hours before an entire military tradition was about to be broken, one exhausted man still found room somewhere inside himself to think about his wife and to make sure something of himself reached her, even if he never could again. He had not seen her since he left for the front the previous year, and he would, as it turned out, never see her again in this life. She died years later in 1949 while Paulus was still a prisoner of war on the other side of the world, and the two of them never had the chance to say goodbye to each other in person. On the morning of the 31st of January, Soviet troops finally reached Paulus's own headquarters, set up in the basement of a ruined department store in the center of the city. Soviet officers who entered that basement later described him as gaunt, unshaven, and visibly exhausted, a man who looked considerably older than his 52 years, dressed in a uniform that had clearly not been properly cleaned in weeks. It was by any measure an unglamorous end to an army that had once rolled across hundreds of miles of open steppe in a matter of weeks back when this entire campaign still felt to the men fighting it like it might actually be won. His chief of staff handled the actual negotiations while Paulus reportedly waited in a separate room nearby. When Soviet officers later questioned him directly, Paulus offered a small, almost technical objection to the entire framing of the moment, insisting that he had not really surrendered so much as simply been taken by surprise. There is something almost gently absurd about that particular claim. The very last field marshal in a proud, centuries-old military tradition, quibbling over the precise verb used to describe the end of his career, as though the distinction between surrendering and being taken by surprise might somehow soften what history was about to record regardless of which word he preferred. 2 days later, on the 2nd of February, the remaining northern half of the pocket soldiers who had continued fighting even after Paulus's own surrender finally capitulated as well. That date, more than any other single moment, marks the true and complete end of the battle for Stalingrad. When word of Paulus's surrender reached Hitler, his reaction was by every account furious. In private conversation with his own staff afterward, he reportedly pointed out with a kind of cold arithmetic that still lands uncomfortably today, that ordinary German citizens chose to end their own lives by the tens of thousands every single year during peacetime, for reasons far less significant than facing capture in the middle of a lost war. If so many private citizens could apparently find that particular kind of resolve, his argument went, why could a field marshal watching tens of thousands of his own soldiers already dead defending the same ground, not find it too. It is a deeply chilling piece of the logic to sit with the man calculating exactly how replaceable one individual life, even a famous one, actually was to him. He vowed in that same conversation never to appoint another field marshal for the rest of the war. He would go on to break that particular promise 7 more times before the war finally ended, which tells you something worth remembering about vows made in anger by powerful men. I think there is something quietly devastating about the entire shape of this moment once you step back and actually look at it clearly. Hitler had designed that promotion specifically to prevent a symbol of shame from reaching the German public, a field marshal humiliated in enemy captivity. Instead, by attaching that expectation so explicitly, so publicly to the promotion itself, he guaranteed that Paulus's eventual capture would be remembered forever as exactly that particular kind of symbolic moment, the first time in German military history that a field marshal had been taken prisoner. The gesture meant to avoid the outcome ended up writing that outcome permanently into the history books instead. Something near 91,000 exhausted, starving, frostbitten German soldiers were taken prisoner in the days surrounding that surrender on top of everyone already killed across the preceding months of fighting. Most of them had no idea in that particular moment, standing in the snow with their hands raised, exactly what still lay ahead of them in the years to come, deep inside a country that had every reason in the world to treat them without much mercy at all. It is worth remembering before we leave this particular chapter behind that every single one of those 91,000 men had spent the last several months believing at various points in almost exactly the things we've already walked through together in this story. They had believed the summer advance would end the war quickly. They had believed the airlift would keep them fed. They had believed Manstein was coming right up until the moment that hope quietly stopped being spoken out loud at all. Belief, it turns out, was never really in short supply here. It was almost everything built on top of that belief that kept failing to arrive. That part of the story, what actually happened to the men who survived long enough to be marched east into captivity, deserves its own honest telling too, because for a great many of them, surrender turned out to be nowhere near the end of their suffering. It was simply the beginning of an entirely different chapter of it. Surrender for most of those 91,000 men simply traded one kind of suffering for another, longer, quieter, and far less likely to end in anything resembling rescue. They were marched east in long, ragged columns through snow and cold that had already killed thousands of their comrades before a single shot of captivity had even begun. Many never survived those opening marches at all, collapsing from exhaustion, frostbite, or disease along roads that stretched for hundreds of miles toward prison camps that were themselves rarely equipped to receive so many broken men at once. Guards on both sides, it should be said honestly, were not always models of mercy either. This was a war that had already produced almost unimaginable cruelty in both directions, long before Stalingrad ever began, and the treatment of prisoners on this particular death march reflected that grim reality rather than rising above it. The Soviet Union understandably had little sympathy left to offer soldiers who had spent the previous year burning their way across its own territory. Conditions inside those camps were harsh, food was scarce, and disease spread easily among men whose bodies had already been pushed past their limits months before they ever arrived. Of the roughly 91,000 men taken prisoner in those final days, only something like 6,000 ever made it home again. And many of those who did survive were not released for a decade or more, after the war had already ended, some not returning to Germany until 1955. Sit with that math for a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Fewer than 1 in 10. 91,000 men raised their hands in the snow outside Stalingrad, believing at the very least that surrender meant they would eventually see home again. for the overwhelming majority of them that belief turned out to be its own quiet final tragedy. Even Paulus himself, the man who'd just become the very first German field marshal in history to be taken prisoner, spent years in Soviet captivity before eventually settling in East Germany, where he lived out the remainder of his life working somewhat improbably as a military historian, writing and lecturing about the very campaign that had defined and ultimately ended his career. He never saw his wife again. She died while he was still a prisoner thousands of miles away, without either of them ever getting the chance to say a proper goodbye in person. Zoom out now, all the way out, and look at the full scope of what this single battle actually cost, because I do not think any individual number we have discussed so far quite prepares you for the total. Axis forces all told suffered something in the neighbourhood of 800,000 casualties across the entire 5-month campaign, killed, wounded, captured, or simply missing. Soviet forces suffered even more, somewhere around 1.1 million. And civilians, the people who never wore a uniform at all, who simply happened to reside in a city that 2 dictators decided was worth destroying, rather than abandoning, lost something near 40,000 of their own. Many of them in the opening hours of a single afternoon we spent quite a lot of time on earlier in this story. Add all of that together and you arrive at a number that truly struggles to fit inside ordinary human comprehension. Something approaching 2 million people, killed, wounded, or captured across roughly 5 months inside and around a single city. Try for a moment to picture every single seat in the largest football stadium in the world filled about 20 times over, and you still would not quite reach the total. To put it in one more way, if you tried to hold a single minute of silence for every person killed, wounded, or captured across this one battle alone, you would be standing in silence for nearly 4 years, straight longer than the entire Second World War itself actually lasted. That is not a comparison I offer lightly. It is simply the only way I have found to make a number this size feel like it is actually describing human beings rather than simply describing itself. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, one I do not think has a comfortable answer. When a cost reaches a scale that large, does it actually change how we're able to feel about it, compared to a smaller, more human-sized tragedy we can actually hold in our minds all at once? I suspect for most of us the honest answer is yes, and I am not sure that says anything particularly flattering about human nature. Numbers this large tend to flatten into abstraction, precisely when they should be doing the opposite. That more than anything else is probably why we spent this entire story returning again and again to individual names, individual faces, a girl with a teacup, a sergeant with a handful of men, a sniper with a hunter's patience. Names are how a number this size finally becomes bearable enough to actually understand. Strategically, this battle marked the true turning point of the entire war in the East. Germany's Sixth Army, one of its most powerful fighting forces, simply ceased to exist. The initiative that Germany had held since the very first days of its invasion passed permanently into Soviet hands, and from this point onward the Red Army would spend the remaining 2 years of the war pushing steadily westward all the way to Berlin itself. Beyond the Eastern Front, the psychological ripple reached considerably further too. Word of the disaster reached Allied leaders gathering that same January at a conference in the Moroccan city of Casablanca, where Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were meeting to plan the shape of the rest of the war, and news arriving from the Eastern Front only strengthened their shared resolve. Barely 2 months earlier, British and American forces had also begun turning the tide in North Africa, defeating German forces at a place called El Alamein. Historians looking back on this period often point to these 2 victories together, one fought in freezing Russian ruins, the other in scorching North African sand, as the twin hinges on which the entire war finally began swinging in the Allies' favour. If you ever have the chance to visit the city itself today, renamed Volgograd since the 1960s, you can still stand on the hill where so much of this story unfolded, the same hill Chuikov once used as a command post before German bombardment drove him underground. Chuikov himself, the general with the gold-toothed smile who promised to defend the city or die trying, kept the first half of that promise, and as it turned out, not the second. He survived the war entirely, went on to command troops all the way into Berlin 2 years later, and eventually asked before he died to be buried back on that same hill, overlooking the Volga, the only Soviet marshal ever laid to rest outside Moscow. Vasily Zaitsev survived too, his eyesight nearly lost to a mortar blast in the war's final months before doctors managed to save it, and he lived on for decades afterward, eventually reburied on that same hill in the 2000s, not far from the general he once served under. An enormous statue now rises from that same summit. A sword raised, a figure caught mid-stride, visible for miles across the surrounding landscape. Beneath it lie the remains of tens of thousands of the men who died defending that particular stretch of ground. Most of them never formally identified their names, simply absorbed into the wider anonymous weight of the battle itself. Walk further down that same hill today, and you will find an eternal flame burning inside a circular hall, guarded around the clock, the names of the fallen etched into walls that seem to stretch on for longer than feels physically possible. Even now, more than 80 years later, gardeners tending the hillside occasionally still turn up fragments of shrapnel buried in the soil, tiny rusted pieces of a battle that technically ended decades ago, but which the ground itself, it seems, has never quite finished remembering. Every year on the 2nd of February, the anniversary of that final surrender, the city still holds a moment of silence, sirens sounding across Volgograd, at the exact hour the guns finally fell quiet more than 8 decades ago, an entire modern city pausing together to remember people almost none of its current residents ever actually met. Visitors still come by the millions every single year, not for entertainment, but for something nearer to quiet pilgrimage. And that brings us back at last to somewhere this whole story actually began. A 13-year-old girl pouring tea for her mother on an ordinary summer morning with absolutely no idea what her city was about to become. Maya Chuprina survived. I want to say that plainly because I think you have earned the relief of hearing it stated outright rather than left hanging. She stayed exactly where we last left her, beside her mother, helping treat the wounded through months of fighting that eventually swallowed nearly every street she had grown up walking as a child. She did not step away from that work until the battle for her city was completely finally over. The same week Paulus surrendered in that department store basement, nearly half a year after the sky above her home first turned black with bombers. A girl who woke up one ordinary morning thinking about tea and summer holiday ended up quietly, stubbornly present for almost the entire arc of one of the deadliest battles in human history, and lived to tell people decades later exactly what she had witnessed. I do not know everything about the rest of her life, what she did after the war, whether she married, whether she ever went back to stand quietly on that same street corner where her ordinary summer morning had once, without any warning at all, turned into history. What I do know is that when she was asked many years later to describe that first day, the words she reached for were not about strategy, or generals, or the fate of nations. They were simply about how frightening it had been, and how somehow she had kept going anyway. I think that might be the most honest summary of this entire battle that exists anywhere, offered not by a historian or a general, but by a 13-year-old girl who grew up to become exactly the kind of ordinary hero this story turned out to be full of. I keep returning to her in my own mind, if I am honest with you, more than almost anyone else in this entire story, generals included. Because I think she represents something this battle proves over and over again in 100 different forms, through Chekhov's stubbornness, through Pavlov's building, through a sniper's patience, through soldiers sharing a single loaf of bread 7 ways. History likes to organize itself around the decisions of powerful men in distant rooms, men chasing symbols, oil fields, and rival names on a map. But the actual weight of history, the part that determines whether any of those decisions ultimately succeed or collapse, tends to rest on people like Maria, ordinary, unglamorous, and almost never given the credit their endurance actually deserves. There is a temptation telling a story this large, this historically significant, to wrap it up with some tidy universal lesson, the kind of neat moral a story like this can supposedly teach us about avoiding war altogether. I do not think it is quite that simple, and I would rather be honest with you than falsely comforting. Human beings have been making exactly these same mistakes, chasing pride over strategy, ignoring inconvenient warnings, mistaking stubbornness for strength for as long as recorded history has existed, and Stalingrad did not end that pattern any more than it began it. What this story does offer, I think, is something quieter and maybe more useful than a simple warning. It offers proof repeated over and over across 5 brutal months that even when the people making the big decisions get almost everything wrong, ordinary human beings underneath them are still capable of extraordinary things, not because anyone ordered them to be, but simply because the person standing next to them needed help and they were there. A frozen hell broke a war machine. That was the promise this story opened with, and I hope by now you understand exactly how literally true that turned out to be. Not through some single brilliant tactic or one decisive weapon, but through months of ordinary people simply refusing to stop in a city that by any reasonable military logic probably should have fallen in a matter of weeks. Thank you honestly for spending this much time with me tonight, sitting through a story that was never going to be an easy or comfortable one to tell. If it moved something in you even a little, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. And if you have not already done so earlier in this video, a like and a subscribe truly helps. This kind of story keep reaching more people who might need to sit with it too. There are so many more nights like this one still waiting to be told. Other cities, other winters, other ordinary people who found themselves standing at the center of something enormous entirely by accident. I hope you will come back and let me tell you one of those stories soon. Until then, sleep well and take care of each other.